Modern warfare is dominated by technology. Never more so than with the combat helicopter. Today's machines are lethal, agile, and survivable. Put that together with new digital technology, and you have the ultimate weapon that will revolutionize how battles are fought.
On your call.
After the Second World War, a new tool became available to commanders on the battlefield: the helicopter. It was now possible to move troops and their equipment rapidly across the combat zone. Helicopters didn't need airfields because they could take off and land from a space the size of a tennis court, and they could operate over any terrain. Natural barriers like rivers, jungles, and deserts were no obstacle to these machines. The Americans used helicopters in the Korean War to evacuate wounded troops to field hospitals, helicopters that were made famous in the television series MASH. And because of the short journey times, many lives were saved that otherwise would have been lost. But it was during the Vietnam War that the helicopter really made its mark. Instead of marching to the battlefront, troops were flown in along with their equipment and ammunition. At first, they were simply troop carriers, but soon they became a lethal attack weapon. Not only could they protect the troops and other helicopters, they could also unleash deadly force against the enemy on the ground. Helicopters had changed battle tactics forever. Today, the helicopter is moving to a new era, that of the digital battlefield. Using digital technology, commanders will be able to know the exact position of their troops, aircraft, and weapons, as well as the enemy's position at any given moment in time. They will also be able to send this information instantly to their troops on the ground and in the sky using one gigantic military internet. This digital battlefield is seen as the most important advance in warfare since the helicopter itself. Leading the charge into the digital age is the deadliest helicopter ever built, the Apache Longbow. It is the supreme attack helicopter and the first to be wired for the digital battlefield. Using sophisticated radar, it can detect and attack multiple targets using its 30mm cannon, rockets, and precision-guided Hellfire missiles. It is the #1 killing machine and the #1 flying machine for pilots.
This is the most ultimate machine to fly. This is like flying a Ferrari.
The Apache aircraft was designed to be a heavy attack platform for the Army, so it provides not only a heavy attack type of capability, but it provides close air support as well as armed escort for other aircraft.
The Apache is designed for combat both during the day and at night, and has seen action in Panama, Somalia, Bosnia, and both Gulf Wars. Its lethal record in combat is matched by its name.
Army aircraft are typically named after Indian tribes within the United States, and the Apache aircraft was named after the Apache tribe, which were fierce warriors during the early times of the United States. So it just was fitting to name this aircraft after the Apache tribe because we were looking to make a very fierce fighting weapons platform.
One reason the Apache Longbow is so effective as an attack helicopter is that different detection and information processing technologies have been integrated into a single aircraft. On the nose of the aircraft are sensors that identify and track targets day and night using high-resolution television, infrared and lasers. The information from the sensors is displayed in the pilot's eyepiece on the helmet, which is linked to the gun, so wherever the pilot looks, the gun points as well. On top of the Apache is the Longbow radar pod, which is used to locate and track targets using a technique called unmasking. The helicopter hides behind cover, then appears above the tree line to allow the radar to detect the enemy before dropping out of sight again.
What Longbow does on the Apache aircraft is it's that fire control radar. It's that ability to, in a matter of seconds, to detect, classify, and prioritize targets, and then download that data to be displayed in front of the pilot, as well as downloading that information into the RF missile.
The Apache Longbow is the first in-service helicopter upgraded for the digital battlefield. Missions are planned on computers and then transferred into the aircraft. In this way, the pilots can load all the data and navigation information for the mission instantly and without error.
There's no way to overemphasize what digitization will mean to the battlefield, because in the past, you typically saw the enemy, you engaged the enemy. Now you're able to quickly determine where the enemy is, where the friendlies are, and in a matter of seconds engage them with any weapon system on the battlefield.
Because the Longbow is digital, many of its systems can easily be replicated in a simulator. This means that pilots can be trained on a device that simulates real missions without ever putting aircraft or pilots at risk. At Fort Rucker, Alabama, the US Army is training Longbow Apache helicopter pilots on 4 state-of-the-art simulators. A bit like giant video games, they digitally replicate the exact flight profile and handling of the helicopter.
It is, in fact, one huge video game. It's also a very expensive video game, and it's very real also. Obviously, what we do is very real. So it's a huge benefit for us to have this trainer so that we can train them up and have them ready to fight. The new trainees have the ability to come in here. They learn how to start the aircraft. They learn to familiarize themselves with the cockpits, then can fly the aircraft, get a little experience actually flying the machine, and can actually work with their stick buddy.
All right, you ready? I'm going to have Brent break to the left, so stay on it.
On real missions, pilots must not only look out for the enemy, but also other Apaches. This system can even link the simulators together.
There's an old joke about simulators where you have to watch out for the other simulators. Well, in here it's real. These simulators can be linked up together, and you can actually look out left and right at the other simulated aircraft. Well, the Longbow Crew Trainer allows us to simulate the digital battlefield. In here we can simulate almost everything, so it's essential to the future.
The simulator can recreate most battlefield scenarios, but when pilots are out on a real mission, it's real bullets being fired at them. The Apache Longbow helicopter's role is to engage the enemy, so it has to be able to survive hostile fire. It's designed with a slender profile, making it difficult to hit when attacked head-on, and is heavily armoured around the cockpit.
This right here is an armor panel that'll come out and it'll protect us on our sides. In between the cockpit, we have a blast shield that will prevent any kind of round. If a round does get inside of one of the cockpits, it will not penetrate through to the other cockpit to take both pilots out.
The flight controls and computer systems have backups in case they are disabled by enemy fire. In addition, the rotor blades and fuel tanks can take hits without failing, and even the gearbox can run dry of oil for 30 minutes to give added survivability. The Apache Longbow is principally a killing machine, and it requires special qualities to become its pilot.
It's the aggressive nature of an attack pilot. The attack pilot is always out there looking for a fight, and he's willing to get into the scrap, and he's willing to put his neck on the line in order to protect the soldiers on the ground.
The attack pilot is your more aggressive Type A personality. He's going to go out there and his job is to want to get into the fight. He's going to have the courage to want to stay in the fight and to mission first, mission accomplishment. We're out there to protect the ground guys. We're out there to protect other helicopters that we may be escorting, and we're very, very mission oriented. This is the greatest job that you can possibly have. I wouldn't trade it for the world.
The thing that links all pilots everywhere is their shared passion for flying, regardless of the aircraft or its role. Nolan Beck has been flying for 18 years and is a test pilot on one of the most successful military helicopters ever made, the Black Hawk.
I love to fly any aircraft, but what I like most about the Black Hawk is its versatility. I can be moving troops one day across enemy lines, moving cargo one day, and moving external loads the next day. It's very easily changeable. It's not the same mission every day.
The Black Hawk flies 50% of the Army's flying hours. $1,550 of them. We're still buying them to go to 1,680. It performs every major aviation mission that we have. It can be fully armed and is fully armed in several configurations.
The Black Hawk has been in every war the United States has fought since the 80s. It's a utility helicopter carrying out virtually every job on the battlefield. Troop and equipment carrying, medical evacuation, search and rescue, even command and control missions.
The history of the Black Hawk is such that it was named for Chief Black Hawk. He was a chief of the Sauk tribe in the Rock Island, Illinois area. And the chief sided with the British in the War of 1812. And subsequent to that war, he became very close to some of our leaders. In particular, in 1833, President Andrew Jackson became very impressed with his candor, courage, and convictions. And we became a great national icon. And subsequently, we named the aircraft the Black Hawk after the chief.
The Black Hawk is a fairly powerful aircraft. It can lift a lot of troops and a lot of equipment. It gets there quickly, and it handles quite nicely. It's very responsive.
The Black Hawk, like all combat helicopters, flies low when possible to avoid being detected and attacked.
One of the other great advantages of flying a helicopter is being able to fly at treetop level. This reduces your exposure time to enemy forces, which enhances your survivability rate. on the other side of that is that when you're flying close to the trees, anything that sticks up out of the trees could pose a hazard to your aircraft. So you have to constantly scan outside the aircraft and make sure you don't run into obstructions. I've flown high-performance jets and helicopters, and flying a helicopter at treetop level, I think, is a lot more exciting than flying a jet at altitude.
Automated weather observation 225 Zulu weather wind 2.
But for all its excellence, the Black Hawk is not equipped for the coming digital age.
We seek overmatch of the enemy in so many ways: lethality, survivability, sustainability, transportability. I mean, we have so many ways that we want to be far superior to our enemy, one of which is information or digitization.
Information is crucial to success on the battlefield. Digitization provides the commanders and pilots with situational awareness, which is the ability to know at any given moment exactly where the enemy is, as well as friendly forces. Essential if one is to hit the enemy and not one's allies.
You cannot overstate the significance of that. That's very, very profound.
Get a little bit of altitude over top of it. Okay, we're going to have to turn and go back up the mountain.
Colonel Lake sees it rather like a one-sided chess game.
I guess there is an analogy, and I've heard it a long time ago when digitization was at its very, very inception, and these concepts were being briefed to the leadership of the Army at that time, and they likened it to a chess game where there was a two-way mirror. And a person on one side was able to see what both teams were doing, and the other person could see only what he was doing in the mirror. And of course, it really gets worse than that, because that person would likely not even be able to know what he was doing. But that's probably a great analogy. You can see everything. They can only see what they're doing at best.
Despite its superb combat record, if the Black Hawk's to become part of the future digital army, it will need a digital upgrade.
For about half the price of a new aircraft, we can remanufacture the UH-60A models, give them 20 years additional service life, full glass cockpit, getting rid of analog steam gauges, removing the obsolescence problem from the avionics. We refurbish the aircraft, treat it for corrosion and stresses and those sorts of things, put on more powerful engines, wide chord blades. It becomes more maneuverable. It's going to fit in perfectly with the objective force, and it'll give it, the Army, the utility helicopter for the next 20 to 30 years without having to go out and do a new start.
For now, the Black Hawk has an interim upgrade with digital screens in the medical evacuation model.
This is the HH-60L, the latest version of the Medevac Black Hawk helicopter. It has a Medevac interior with litters in the back and a forward-looking infrared mounted on the nose. If you look up front, the primary difference on the cockpit is a step towards digitization to get away from the old steam gauges. We have a flight management system, allows the pilot centralized control of all communications and navigation functions, and a multifunction liquid crystal display which displays FLIR imagery and will also display flight plan and communication and navigation information.
Keeping successful designs going is United States Army policy. One machine that has made the grade from analog to digital is Black Hawk's big brother, the Chinook. 50 feet long and weighing a mighty 32,000 pounds, the twin-rotored Chinook has been in service since the Vietnam War in 1972. But despite its age, it's been upgraded for the digital battlefield. Tandem rotors, a loading ramp in the tail, and the ability to carry heavy loads slung underneath makes the Chinook the most versatile military helicopter ever created.
This one is named for a Chinook tribe, but also this one puts out a lot of wind, and there's a Chinook wind. So this is almost like a flying tornado with the amount of downwash that this aircraft puts out.
Most helicopters, like the Apache and Black Hawk, use a main rotor for lift and have a smaller tail rotor that prevents the fuselage from spinning around. However, this uses a significant amount of engine power that could have been used for lift. On a tandem rotor helicopter like the Chinook, the two main rotors rotate in opposite directions, cancelling out any tendency for the fuselage to want to spin. And so all the available power from the twin engines goes to both rotors solely for lift.
We talk about the Chinook being a tandem rotor helicopter and it being an innovation. It's not really an innovation. It's a 40-year-old innovation. It stood the test of time because it provides you such great longitudinal stability and control within the aircraft.
The Chinook is the king of the heavy lift, being capable of carrying 26,000 pounds, the equivalent of a small tank. It's especially good at high altitude work, where the air is thin and the efficiency of the blades deteriorates.
It's been the only helicopter that the U.S. forces have had that have been able to operate in altitudes in excess of 16,000 feet in Afghanistan. I don't want to get into criticizing my Black Hawk brothers because it's a great aircraft for what it's designed to do. It just was not capable of operating with any useful payload at that altitude.
As well as being able to operate up high, the Chinook is just as good down low. It was designed to float like a boat and can land on water for special operations. These elite forces have adapted their Chinooks with long-range tanks and the ability to refuel in flight, and added classified weapons and electronics to this remarkable aircraft. Because the Chinook is an extremely large aircraft, it requires a crew of 4.
Probably the most important aspect of flying this aircraft is proper crew coordination. There are pilots up front, however, probably the two most important individuals in the aircraft would be the flight engineer and the crew chief. Those individuals are responsible for securing loads, calling us into landing zones, and maintaining clearance of such a large aircraft.
Like all pilots, Major Jones still has that passion for flight that started when he was a boy.
Well, flying a helicopter is something I've always wanted to do since I was a child, and flying at the speed of sound is certainly a thrill, but I think there's nothing like flying on a deck, you know, right on top of the trees, at the Earth's surface, under night vision goggles with poor illumination. I don't think it gets any more challenging than that.
There are several different versions of the Chinook, and the latest is being developed as a digital aircraft with computers and digital screens. It's hoped that these upgrades will extend the life of the Chinook for another 20 years, and it will successfully integrate into the digital battlefield. However, upgrading the pilots is not so simple.
Old dogs like me that have been flying this thing for quite a while are used to all the old analog systems. The young kids coming up today have grown up with computers. They've accommodated it through learning through the processes. The learning curve to transition to this type of environment is more difficult for me because I learned on something else, and I have what we call negative habit transfer, trying to overcome that. Crosby's philosophy is if you want to test this system equitably, go to the mall and get the kid that's been playing the video games all day and come see how he does with it.
With the United States moving towards a fully digitized army, will they still be able to fight alongside their less technologically advanced allies?
We're going to work with allies, we're going to work with friends, and it doesn't make their systems ineffective if they're not digitized. It will reduce their effectiveness, as we have. That's why we're striving to digitize our platforms, because we see as an effectiveness enhancement.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the British Royal Navy is also working towards creating its own digitised helicopter force. In Gulf War II, the closest ally that worked alongside the United States was the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy has its own fleet of combat helicopters, some among the most advanced in the world. Like the US helicopters, they have excellent designs. But in the race towards digitization, some still lag behind. One successful aircraft in need of an upgrade is the Royal Navy's Mark 8 Lynx helicopter. The Lynx holds the world speed record at 400 kilometers an hour and is designed as an anti-surface and anti-submarine helicopter.
The Lynx is the world's fastest production helicopter, and it's very, very agile. It has a special rotor head which allows it to be very aerodynamic in comparison to other helicopters. Makes it a wonderful aircraft to fly as a pilot. It's especially agile. It's not very forgiving in that it is very twitchy, but it's like driving a sports car in a comparison to a lot of other helicopters. It's like driving a bit of a bus.
A revolutionary British-designed rotor system allows the helicopter to fly faster because the paddle shape of the blades improves the airflow over their surface and delays the onset of blade stall. Keeping flight crew fully trained for war is a never-ending task. Today, 702 Squadron is being briefed on an exercise to fire live skewer missiles from the Mark 8 Lynx.
OK, good morning, gentlemen. The aim of this morning's brief is to fire and to brief for the firing of 15 live sea skewer weapons. Each crew today will fire...
This is a rare occasion to fire live missiles, so the crew listen attentively.
The targets you're firing against are 20 nautical miles to the northwest of Aberporth in Cardigan Bay, and they consist of 4 100-foot barges with radar reflective targets attached to them. In addition, they have...
Sea skewer is our primary anti-surface weapon. We have 15 missiles to release. Some of them are reaching the end of their life, and we're also trying to ensure that some of the younger people on the unit are getting some experience of firing their missiles. Skewer is a semi-active medium-range missile, and its primary aim is to damage and set on fire, if you like, smaller fast patrol boats and smaller frigates, corvette size.
The Lynx crew of 2 consists of a pilot and an observer.
It's my role to detect the enemy shipping, to classify it so that we know whether we're actually firing at the right target, and then to deploy the weapon. To do that, I'd illuminate it with the radar, and then using the radar, I'd guide the missile onto the target.
The Sea Skewer is an extremely effective missile. Its high explosive warhead only detonates once it penetrates the skin of the ship, creating internal fires.
I have flown with live skewer many times in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s. However, it's the first time I've ever fired one. It was very exciting, actually. A little nervous, obviously, but it's a very good high feeling of satisfaction when the missile drops off, the motors go, and on further inspection, when we had a look at the targets, it hit exactly where we expected it to hit.
The mission was a success, with the skewer blasting a hole through the target. In addition to the skewer missile, the Lynx can also carry torpedoes and depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. it has recently acquired a new half-inch caliber machine gun for use against fast-moving craft. But for all the Mark 8 Lynx's effectiveness in combat, it is yet to be digitised for the future battlefield.
To enable us to be part of the digital battlefield, we need to have the same equipment and the compatible equipment with all our NATO and other allies that we are likely to work with. The other aircraft within the fleet ARM are getting to the digital battle space. That includes the Sea King Mark 7 and the Merlin. We're a little way behind that, but the upgrades we are expecting to get in the next few years should enable us to catch up and be part of that integrated picture.
Some Royal Navy helicopters have entered the digital battlefield, and it's the Sea King, for many years workhorse of the Royal Navy, that now houses the technology to bring the fleet into the 21st century. Although the Sea King is over 30 years old, the new Mark 7 version has been radically improved electronically. Using a large, movable radar pod on its side, it is now the first advanced surveillance and control helicopter in the world.
The avionics have been completely upgraded, so the radar is new. It's a very powerful radar, and in addition to that, it's got state-of-the-art data link, which is basically real-time information relay to anybody within the theatre of operations. It's a massive leap for the Navy. The main thing is we've moved away from a single role of AW to airborne surveillance and control, which means the carrier can take away this platform with them and carry out complete battle space management, control of aircraft, ships and land forces in one platform.
What makes the Mark 7 Sea King so special is that it can actually process 3 different radar modes at the same time. This means it can relay information between sea, air and overland contacts and control all those areas of operation instantaneously, while at the same time sending the data back to its ship on a new fast digital connection known as Link 16.
The platforms that are used in that role are normally large fixed wings with a dozen or so crew. And the beauty of this is that we can stick this on an aircraft carrier with 3 crew and provide pretty much the same service.
Although the equipment was very new to the crews of 849 Squadron, while working alongside the Americans in Gulf War II, they produced some spectacular results that were crucial to the Allied campaign.
The Gulf War II, Mark 7 played a vital role, not only for our own forces, but the Link 16 enabled it to integrate with the Americans and also our troops on the ground as well. So we were able to relay that information instantaneously to them.
45 safety, 270 range 150. We're doing a fire order. We're ready to go on the target. It is safe surface.
As advanced as the Mark 7 is, there's still room for further development on the helicopter.
One area that we still need to address is exactly that, our own self-defence. We're looking at various systems at the moment that will provide our aircraft with its own defence aid suite. So at the moment, we are heavily reliant on other forces actually protecting our aircraft.
But the performance of the Mark 7 has been so impressive that new capabilities are being discovered almost daily.
There's still an awful lot to learn. I mean, we've only had it really front line for just over a year. So we're learning things all the time. I mean, the Gulf War was a massive learning curve for us, and that's continuing.
From the most sophisticated surveillance and control digital system in the world to the most modern combat helicopter in service anywhere, the Royal Navy's Merlin. It's the first helicopter to be developed by the Royal Navy in 25 years, and it's a quantum leap forward in technology for the United Kingdom.
It's a fantastic aircraft to fly, very, very manoeuvrable. I mean, given the size of it, it's particularly manoeuvrable. I've flown 5 or 6 different types of helicopters now, but this is certainly my favourite. There's a lot of power. The Rolls-Royce engines produce a lot of power for the aircraft, and it's real fun to fly. The Merlin is without doubt the most advanced in-service helicopter in the world today. It's got a fantastic avionics suite, 3 engines, redundancy on almost every system. But also there, we can stay out for longer by shutting one of the engines down in flight, which makes our endurance particularly good, up to 4.5 to 5 hours with one engine shut down.
The Merlin has 2 main roles in combat: anti-submarine and anti-surface warfare.
We can carry 4 Stingray torpedoes, 4 Mark II depth chargers, or a variety of GPMG general purpose machine guns which we can mount in the cabin door and the windows. The radar is very powerful, and it's what we call a pulse compression radar. So what it does is send a very powerful pulse out a long distance, and we can track contacts up to 160 miles away. What the radar also does is automatically track those contacts for us and give us the tracking and time information, which again can be transmitted on the data link back to the surface units. On the 6 LCD displays, we have all the information from the sensors, which are displayed in a variety of colours. For example, the hostiles we can display as red, the friendlies we can display as green, and those colour displays are sent to the ship. So straight away, when that comes through on data link, the ship knows whether we think it's a hostile or a friendly unit.
Because the Merlin is digital, it's easy to run simulated missions. There's a dedicated Merlin training centre which houses 4 simulators, all of which can be linked from one main control room. This allows the crews to practice all types of missions in a safe, controlled environment. All this high technology and promise of a future digital battlefield to be viewed and fought on computer screens makes war begin to sound like one giant video game. But what would such a game look like? There's a possibility to glimpse this future at an army base in Alabama. At Fort Rucker, they're training officers and pilots to fight wars on a super simulator called the Cav Sim. In this mock headquarters, commanders are learning how to fight today's battles with their troops and helicopters. They're in communication with their pilots flying 8 simulated helicopters. Each cubicle can be configured to provide any helicopter needed for the exercise.
Stay below. They won't see you. You might be able to pop up as well. Roger, spot report to follow. Break to observe the town. But yeah, stay behind that ridge line.
Crowd north, vicinity garage check. Increase.
And 1-2, we're coming right to
non-hostile break.
Here in Master Control, also known as the Stealth Room, instructors play God, managing the battle as well as controlling the enemy. In charge is Captain Dan Knott.
The commander tracks the battle using post-it notes on a regular map and butcher blocks or a piece of paper just to write things down. From there, they translate it up to me via the radios to where I can then see what's going on in their eyes. Whereas in reality, I'm watching a computer screen that tells me exactly where everybody is and how the computer links in the enemy and the friendly and the aircraft, and I can see the big picture, much like what you're going to have in a few years, where everything is tracked, all the vehicles, we know exactly where they are, we know exactly where the enemy is.
They can see everything, a true vision of how battles will be fought in the future.
My position marked with yellow smoke.
It is very similar to a video game, and I tease my children and my wife on a daily basis that's what I do all day is play video games.
Roger, just got a call from Eagle 5. What he wants to do, break.
But the video game is becoming reality. In West Palm Beach, Florida, it's the dawn of a new age for warfare, the digital age. In a research facility in southern Florida, the world's first helicopter conceived and designed to be totally digital is under test. Called the Comanche, it's scheduled to be in service in 2009. Everything from detection systems to flight controls have been created to work in the digital battlefield. This aircraft is the culmination of everything that has gone before and can truly be called the ultimate combat helicopter. Head of the project, Colonel Bob Birmingham, has watched the program develop over many years.
This is aircraft number 2. It's our second Comanche prototype. We've had a very successful flight test program, and this has been a major part of it. On the front end, we have recently integrated our electrical optical sensor system, and then very soon in the future, we're going to be able to design in our laser warning receiver and our radar warning receiver on the front end of this. The cockpits we designed really to be identical in terms of the way the flight control systems operate and what the displays are going to show the pilots, and we did that really to reduce the amount of training that it's going to take to really operate the aircraft. This is really where we're going to house our missile systems, and also gives us the capability to store internal fuels that as we need to go and fly deeper missions. You can see that there's really no exhaust system on here. We really are going to vent the exhaust, and we're going to cool the exhaust and the heat from that through an exhaust system that's going to run all the way down to the tail. When you get down to the tail, and if you take a look up at the rotor system, you can really take a look at why this aircraft is really different. These are the bearingless rotor system, 5-bladed rotor system with torque tubes that run through the system, give it a tremendous amount of power and strength and flexibility. On the fantail, again, a very robust design. This really handles about 900 shaft horsepower that comes straight back from the engines in there. And you can see that how we've got this design is a very protected area, really gives it a tremendous capability, protection against enemy threat systems, ballistics capability, and again, a very, very unique and robust design.
Unlike previous helicopters, flight control computers ensure the pilot flies within the limitations of the machine. They prevent him overstressing the airframe and rotor system or damaging the engines by using excessive power. This fly-by-wire system gives the Comanche some unique handling qualities. Test pilot Bill Fell explains.
I've flown a number of other helicopters, and if you, in another helicopter, took the stick and took it to the extreme of one lateral axis to the other extreme lateral axis, even if you did it slowly, you've probably broken something in that helicopter. In this helicopter, I can slam the stick from one side stop to the other side stop as fast as I possibly can, and I haven't broken anything. All I've done is achieve some incredible roll rates.
As a result, the aircraft can perform maneuvers that until now designers could only dream about.
This aircraft we can fly backwards in excess of 80 knots. We can fly sidewards in excess of 70 knots. Those are not things that you can do in other helicopters, and this aircraft handles it very well. You also, in flying backwards at 80 knots or sidewards at 70 knots, you can do that with your hand off of the controls. It will do it all by itself. Basically, if the computer's flying the aircraft for you, then it reduces your workload so that you can perform other tasks. You can assist in targeting, and assist in communications.
The Comanche was designed from the start to be survivable on the battlefield. It's officially not called stealthy, but it is said to have low observability. It has an extremely thin shape, making it difficult for radar to detect and hard to see at a distance, and its retractable landing gear further reduces its observable profile. Also, by burying the engines internally and having a clever design of tail rotor, the noise generated is greatly reduced. To minimise the risk of thermal detection, the hot exhaust gases from the engines are cooled inside the tail before leaving the aircraft, thus reducing the threat of attack from heat-seeking missiles. Every system on the aircraft is digital, but what sets the Comanche apart is the onboard information gathering computers.
The brains of this aircraft really have to do with the aircraft's ability to collect information. All totally integrated into the cockpit, into the mission control computer cluster. That provides the capability with a tremendous amount of information from the sensors that go out there.
These digital detection systems will be able to provide the commander's backup base with constant information on the position of the enemy and their own forces. The Comanche will become the eyes and ears for the commanders of the future, giving them the power to control the battlefield.
Comanche is clearly a skip-a-generation technology. This is not one generation better than its predecessors that we have out there. This is 2 generations better. This does things twice as good as any of the conventional aircraft that we have out there, and it does it twice as fast. This will transform the world. This will change the way that we fight wars in the world. This is an information system, and information is power, and that's what Comanche provides to the future commanders.
In motorsport, the glory of winning masks a risk that all competitors accept.
You'd be kidding yourself if you thought that you were going to go racing where you're not going to have a crash.
These crashes are extraordinary, pushing the human body to its limits, sometimes with fatal consequences.
Because you're having an aircraft accident, you're not having a car accident.
It's kind of like jumping out of an intercity train, I would say, if you were trying to replicate that experience at home.
Welcome to the violent world of the ultimate racing crashes. In a roadside accident, a driver will experience a force of 30 G on their body. This sudden deceleration can have devastating consequences even at low speeds.
50% of all fatal crashes have a delta V below 30 miles an hour.
But in racing collisions, the G-force driver's experience is now into the hundreds.
I went head-on into the wall at about 210 miles an hour, and so, I mean, literally, I never lifted the throttle trace, just went like straight down. And
You know, when you're flying through the air at 130, 140 mile an hour, that's not very satisfying, you know. You know that it's not going to be pretty when you land.
And yet today, 99 times out of 100, the racers will walk away with only minor injuries.
I didn't have a headache, I didn't black out, nothing.
This program examines the pivotal crashes that rocked the motorsport world and shocked the viewing public. It will investigate the accidents themselves, go on to explore the aftermath and the victims' battle for survival. From the post-war years, when the dynamics of a crash weren't understood and every season 1 in 7 drivers lost their lives, to the latest developments which today keep racers alive. But of all the disasters, one had the most profound effect. Captured live on television, this single crash shook the racing fraternity to its very core. Its aftermath brought about sweeping alterations to racetracks across the world to slow the cars down. The San Marino Grand Prix on the 1st of May 1994 was a black day in motor racing history.
Well, Formula One had been 12 years without a fatality of any kind, and there had been no enormous name to die in Formula One for many years. There was an entire generation of Formula One drivers who had grown up and gone through the schooling formulas and into Formula One, not even considering death as a factor.
The racing community almost believed that they'd managed to tame the effects of an impact, but they were wrong. This crash reminded them of the fatal nature of their business and took the life of Formula One's leading light.
Ayrton Senna was one guy who could not die in a race car. He was just too good. He was the Mozart of Formula One drivers. He was meticulous. He was brilliant. He couldn't die.
Senna had reached the point where he was unquestionably the man. He was the benchmark. He'd won the championship 3 times.
At that time, Imola in northern Italy was one of the fastest tracks in Formula One, and thus one of the most exciting to race on. But that weekend started badly when Senna's fellow Brazilian Rubens Barrichello crashed during Friday's qualifying session.
Senna was deeply upset by that accident, went to visit Barrichello, was relieved he was okay. But there's no question that Friday evening, everybody had been given a little bit of a jolt here. Saturday, of course, we had the death of Roland Ratzenberger.
The fact that Ratzenberger's crash was the result of a car failure was of little consequence. A visibly upset Senna even confessed to his girlfriend that he didn't want to race the next day. He died 24 hours later from a crash at Imola's notorious flat-out corner, Tamburello Bend.
Tamburello was this sweeping left-hander, which was technically not a particularly difficult corner. The problem was that it had this wall on the outside.
But that's why it was so exciting. You had disaster right there. You literally were looking disaster in the face in that concrete wall.
This is a reconstruction of the view from Senna's car as he approached Tamburello Bend at nearly 230 kilometers an hour. To understand why Senna may have crashed, you need to know a little about the science that keeps these cars on the road.
The technology is such that cars have become quicker through corners. Straight line speed doesn't really mean an awful lot. You have a combination of tyre technology and car technology, and the two together have combined to make these phenomenal machines through corners.
Formula One cars race at speeds of up to 330 kilometers an hour. The car's hold on the track is from a combination of mechanical grip generated by the suspension and aerodynamic grip from the wings. But all of that must go through the tyres.
Now, a racing tyre is fundamentally different to a road car tyre. The surface temperature of a racing tyre is around 150 to 200 degrees C, somewhere in that window. If you were able to put your hand on the tyre and pull it away, it would be coated in rubber. It's that sticky. It's approaching chewing gum.
But at speeds greater than the takeoff velocity of a jet aircraft, the cohesion created by the high tyre temperature is not enough to keep the car on the road. This is where downforce comes in.
The aim of downforce is to increase the force pressing the car onto the circuit, onto the tarmac, and that's to increase the friction between the tyre and the track.
Designers had discovered that accelerating the airflow under the car creates a negative pressure which sucks it into the road. The closer you bring the car to the road, the greater the downward force. But it's a risky business, because if the car makes contact with the tarmac, all this downforce is suddenly lost. As Senna was about to negotiate the Tamburello Bend for the 7th time, sparks were seen coming from the rear of his car, a sure sign it was bottoming out.
When the belly of the car hits, that means that the wheels are now sitting too high in relationship to the car to do you any good for maneuverability, for steering.
In 1994, Formula One cars would often bottom out on straights with no consequence, but during cornering, it was a potentially hazardous situation.
We've all had conkers on strings and swung them around our heads, and if you cut the string, the conker flies off. It's exactly the same with a racing car. If you lose adhesion or grip with the circuit, you fly off the circuit.
Lap 7 of the San Marino Grand Prix, Senna crashed at Tamburello Bend.
One of the world's greatest racing drivers, Ayrton Senna, has died after a horrifying crash today at the San Marino Grand Prix in Italy.
All of a sudden, the image of Formula One changed. It was back to a blood series worldwide. And Formula One had been like that in the 60s and early 70s, but now you were in the 1990s, an era where safety and good health and the denial of death by society as a whole. You know, we'd quit smoking, we'd gotten more fit, we didn't want to have heart attacks anymore. Western society as a whole was denying death, and Formula One was going along with it, that you prolonged life as long as you absolutely could. Now you have a guy in his prime, boom, gone.
The shock of Senna's death was enormous, and I went to his funeral, in fact, carried him to his last resting place. And when that accident happened, Brazil came out in mourning. I mean, the roads were lined 10 deep for the funeral procession.
The fact Ayrton Senna's death was witnessed live by millions sent shockwaves across the world. But inside the racing fraternity, people were still trying to understand how he'd been killed at all.
That shouldn't have been a fatal accident, because cars went off the circuit quite frequently, and they're built so strongly even then that it should have been able to withstand the impact, and he would normally have been expected to walk away from that car. He was just unlucky because the impact was such, the tyre was thrown back, hit him on the head and killed him.
Formula One quickly introduced drastic new safety measures. The car's sides were built up and wheel tethers were added to keep them from reaching the drivers. At the same time, circuits across the world were altered to slow them down, and Tamburello Bend would never be the same again.
At every given point, no matter how safe we think we're making the sport, the danger is still there. But then that is the essential element of the sport.
And people think motor racing is safe today. Well, it is, until the wrong accident occurs.
There's something very gladiatorial about the sport. These guys put themselves on the line every time they get into that car.
No matter what, there will always be crashes, but today's drivers face a different world to those who raced in the terrifying early years. When motor racing resumed after the Second World War, Europe was shattered. But although the risks in such a devastated environment were extreme, the passion to race was all the more great because it represented freedom.
The really great thing about immediate post-war racing was the sense of relief, I think, and that was best expressed to me by George Abacassis, the great British privateer of the time who founded the HWM team. And I said to him once, George, you know, in the late 40s, when you resumed racing on the continent, wasn't it dangerous? And he took his cigarette and its holder out of his mouth, gorgeous George, and said, good Lord, Doug, no, it wasn't dangerous at all, he said. You've got to remember, for the first time in 6 years, we weren't being shot at.
I remember going to my father and saying I want to be a racing driver. He nearly went ballistic. But to cut a long story short, he said, well, if you're going to race, you're going to wear a crash hat. And I can remember turning to my father and saying, Dad, that's a bit sissy. You know, the fast drivers, people like Chiron and Sommer, and they weren't wearing crash hats, they wore these cloth helmets. We didn't wear seatbelts because when you have a shunt, of course, the likelihood of fire was immense. So really, if you were lucky enough, you'd be thrown out and hope you landed on something not too hard.
But this daring mystique came to a sobering end in a horrifying accident with disastrous consequences in 1955 at Le Mans.
In 1955, I was driving for Mercedes-Benz, and I was teamed with Fangio. And Pierre Levesque, of course, was in one of the Mercedes as an invitation drive because he'd done so well the year before.
Pierre Levesque, driving a Mercedes, crashed up and over the tail of an Austin Healey driven by Lance Macklin. and the Mercedes impacted on top of the bank in front of a spectator enclosure and broke up, and the front suspension and engine of the Mercedes was thrown through the crowd like a torpedo.
And the Mercedes hurled itself like a thunderbolt into an enclosure packed with spectators.
It was a tragedy because so many people who were just there to see a race. I mean, a driver accepts the dangers, but for it to go and be the public or a marshal or something, that is fairly unacceptable.
What was a terrible freak accident produced such a devastating death toll that it very nearly ended motorsport.
The grim record that will be remembered from this race at Le Mans is of some 80 dead and more than 100 injured.
Across the world, races were cancelled, and many countries, including Switzerland, have banned racing to this day. But even after this tragedy, the authorities were incapable of improving safety for the drivers.
People generally look over their shoulder and see things through rose-coloured glasses, and they were the good old days. If you raced as a Formula One Grand Prix driver for a period of 5 years, the batting average was that there was a 2 out of 3 chance you were going to die. So they were bad years.
It would take yet another big name to crash to improve safety. But Jackie Stewart's horrific experience at the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix proved that the aftermath was just as deadly as the impact.
Jackie Stewart smashed broadside into the stone abutment of a barn that was there, and that bent the car in two, crushed in the top of the cockpit until the cockpit opening was only 10 inches wide. It twisted Jackie's pelvis round so that he was lying effectively on his side in the cockpit.
And I was trapped for some 20-odd minutes in the car, semi-conscious, coming and going in and out of consciousness. With the electrics not being able to be switched off and me not being able to get out the car. And
the fuel tanks burst and the cockpit then filled up with fuel because he was on full tanks and there was nowhere for the fuel to go. And it began to top up the cockpit. So he was laying strapped and trapped in a bath of petrol.
I was taken eventually, when they found an ambulance, to what they called a medical centre, which was just concrete floor.
And looking around, you told me that the first thing that struck him was that there were all these stubbed out cigarette butts on the floor around him.
This was an eerily sobering experience for Stewart, in which he realised that it was imprudence, not bravery, that sent drivers to their deaths.
Everybody knew the sport was dangerous. It wasn't as if suddenly we found that tiddlywinks was dangerous if you broke your nail and you get some terrible infection underneath your nail. I mean, this was something that we knew we were losing lives on, and we knew that cars crashed, and we knew that we were sometimes catching fire. We knew all of those things, but there were no adequate protection or amenities to either suffocate fires quickly enough or get drivers out of cars or get them to hospitals properly.
As a result of Stewart's tireless campaigning, by the late 70s, rapid medical response was compulsory in racing. However, the drivers were still vulnerable, and 1 in 7 was dying on the racetrack each year. In order to prevent more fatalities, the crash needed scientific management. But it would take until the 80s for a major step forward to be passed down from a device that had been used to understand passenger car injury for over a decade.
When we run a car into the barrier at the proving grounds for the development of a passenger car for safety, we put accelerometers on the chassis, and that gives us the basic, what we call crash pulse or crash signature of the structure of the car.
The accelerometer acts like a black box in an aeroplane, analysing what happens to the car's chassis as it crashes. By placing this accelerometer into the race cars, the engineers could record the real crash in microscopic increments of time. This would tell the engineers precisely when and how the crash happened and what forces injured the driver. For the first time, the racetrack had become an extension of the safety laboratory, and the drivers their test pilots.
The results we had were really quite surprising because almost 90% of the injuries, 89%, were to the foot and ankles, or distal orthopedic injuries. And this, we felt, was an area that we could make a real difference.
We estimated the driver's feet met the wall at 45 miles an hour. That would be like jumping off maybe a 7-story building and landing on your feet. Their ankles were shattered.
The problem was the driver was situated in the car in such a way that his legs actually extended beyond the imaginary axis of the front wheels. So the first thing that ran into something to absorb energy after the nose of the car was gone were the driver's feet.
As a result of this analysis, the designers reinforced the car's nose cones to withstand an incredible 40 tons impact force. And crippling injuries to the feet and ankles practically disappeared overnight. But unfortunately, in crash safety, the solution of one problem just creates another for the engineers. And this new strong nose cone would become a devastating weapon in a car-to-car impact.
If you sort of throw a dart through a piece of paper, the energy just stays in the dart, and the dart keeps on going at the same speed. So you're not actually managing the energy, you're just one structure's moving through another structure.
2001 was a difficult year for Alex Zanardi. He'd returned to the US kart series after a disappointing spell in Formula One. But at the Lausitzring 500 race in Germany, Alex was back on form and giving it his all.
We were near the end of the race, about 13 laps or so to the end of the race, and Zanardi was leading, and he had a pit for fuel.
I was watching in the medical center, the TV monitor there, and saw Alex leave the pits and get onto the pit access road, and he, in his hard charging style that he always has, he was really going too fast. He lost control on the pit access road, went backwards across the racetrack, and much to my horror, was hit broadside by Alex Tagliani's car.
This is a reconstruction of what viewers witnessed on their TV screens. The collision was unavoidable. When cars drive at speeds of 230 kilometers an hour, they travel a whole car length in just 10,000th of a second, and in one complete second, the length of a football pitch. Driving at such speed, Tagliani would have seen Zanardi stationed in the road just over a second before impact.
I thought, personally, after seeing so many crashes, that we were going to be dealing with a double fatality. And of course, my heart sank. I was petrified, as a matter of fact.
We pulled up to the scene. I got out of the truck and started running up the track to the car, and as I got close, I started slipping, and it was a banked track. Slipped and fell on my knees and kind of slid up to the car and that was when I saw he didn't have any legs.
Terry called me on our private radio channel, and he said, this is bad. He said, it's really bad. He said, both legs are gone. And I said, what do you mean gone? He said, they're gone. And I said, is there anything that we can salvage, anything we can save? He said, no, they're destroyed. And he said he's dying.
I've done a lot of road trauma in the past, and that kind of injury in a public setting is almost a certain fatality. In the thighs, the veins are huge. Just take 5 liters and put it in a bucket and then put a hole about the size of a quarter in it in 2 places and see how long it takes to drain, and that's basically what we were dealing with.
Alex was white as a ghost, looked like a ghost. He was unconscious. His eyes had rolled back in his head. He had no response at all.
Zanardi was losing blood rapidly. Dr. Olvey fed 3 IVs into his body to manage this blood loss. This kept him alive, but the diluted blood lacked the vital oxygen needed to feed his brain.
I told him to get him in the helicopter and head for Berlin. I went back inside with Terry to look at Tagliani because he had been in the same crash, and we were sure that he probably had some injuries. So we examined him quickly, determined there was nothing life-threatening with Tag, brought him out on a stretcher to go in a second helicopter, realized that the first helicopter with Alex was still there. And I panicked. I didn't panic. I just very angry, and I went over to the helicopter and I said, you know, the only German words I knew, I grabbed the pilot, I pulled him down out of the helicopter and I pointed to the sky, I said, "Schnell, schnell."
By the time Zanardi reached hospital, he had lost over 72% of his blood volume and had, at the most, 4 minutes left to live. Once stabilised, the doctors now turn their attention to the brain damage this massive blood loss may have caused and place Zanardi into an induced coma.
The induced coma is a method of brain protection. If you can keep the brain quiet in the initial stages of a concussion, whether it's a moderate or severe concussion or a really bad head injury, it's beneficial and allows the brain cells to kind of regroup and begin the healing process.
After 3 days, Zanardi was reanimated.
Daniela, Alex's wife, wanted to be the first one in there when he started to wake up, and we were just amazed and so pleased that because when he did wake up, he recognized Daniela, and he told her at that time that he'd be okay as long as he had her and his son.
Nowadays, it's hoped that improvements in design have almost eradicated the T-bone danger.
When you have this T-bone accident, the survival cell is now so strong that it will resist penetration from the bullet car. And what that means is it will tolerate loads in excess of sort of 20 tons. And it will remain absolutely intact, and all the energy is dissipated into the car that impacted. The nose cones fitted to current Formula 1 cars are a very, very efficient energy absorber, which means if a Formula 1 car hits a brick wall at, say, 40 miles an hour, the nose cone will absorb all of that energy with no damage to the wall and no damage to the rest of the vehicle.
Alex is back being competitive old Alex, and I think 6 months after his injury, he was in a hand-controlled go-kart.
In a world where crashing is an inevitable part of racing, the determination amongst injured drivers to return to the racetrack is immense. But few have shown such incredible willpower as Grand Prix motorbike rider Mick Doohan. Over the course of his astounding racing career, Mick Doohan won the 500cc World Championship a record-breaking 5 consecutive times. However, he's also had over 100 crashes.
I would tell myself at the beginning of the season that I'm probably going to crash twice, you know, and you know, I just hope that I won't hurt myself in those.
A World Championship bike weighs 145 kilos and has 240 horsepower. From standing still, it can travel to 160 kilometers an hour and back to naught in just 16 seconds. And all that power is controlled by the rider's body weight.
At close to 200 mile an hour or 320 kilometres, which we're exceeding these days, the thing only wants to go straight. So unless you put a lot of physical energy into it, it's not going to go anywhere but straight.
In every lap, the riders spend just 11 seconds seated. The rest of the time, they're cornering.
I mean, I have a huge amount of admiration for motorcycle racers. Yeah, they are doing all sorts of things with the bike, which, you know, a common man couldn't even contemplate.
The corners are the most gruelling part of the race. As the bike pitches over to around 50 degrees, the footprint of the tyre on the road changes, lessening the grip with the surface.
With so much horsepower going through the rear wheel, the motorcycle being so light, generally the front, if you rode it just by using your handlebars, the front tyre would actually slide away and you'd crash. So you're not riding the bike with your hands anymore, you're actually throwing it with your body weight and through your footrest.
In doing this, the rider has lowered the centre of gravity on the bike. Now this is where the cornering gets really precarious.
They spin the rear wheel up to control the slip and the slide of the machine in its trajectory through the corner.
In the middle of the corner, the rider now opens the throttle, putting power into the back wheel. This should accelerate them out of the turn, but just one tiny error and they're in a high-side situation.
If In sliding, the tyre suddenly bites, suddenly finds grip. It will kick the machine, and that's a high side.
Whilst high sides are not the most common form of crash, they are the most deadly.
I have seen crashes where realistically at 30 mile an hour on a high side on acceleration coming out of a corner might leap someone 30 feet in distance and 10 feet in the air, and coming down is a very horrendous situation.
It's definitely not like riding down to the local grocery store to get a bottle of milk to take home to have some coffee with.
In 1992, Mick Doohan was on course to win his first ever World Championship title. In fact, journalists were already speculating that, with 6 races left, Doohan just needed to win 2 of them to take the title. But then, a high side at Assen in Holland changed everything.
Long story short, I crashed, the bike landed on top of me. I'm sliding down the road at about 110 mile an hour with the bike on top of me. I tried to spin myself out from underneath it because it's starting to get a little bit warm, not the bike on top of me, but the friction running down the road. I tried to spin myself out from underneath it. Everything spun except for my leg, of course, and I broke my leg.
Doohan had sustained fractures at the base of his right tibia and fibula.
It wasn't what, in medical terms, I'd consider a big injury. You know, it was just a broken leg.
Mick was ferried to the Paddock's mobile clinic, where he was examined by the championship medic, Dr. Costa.
After the fall, I put Mick's leg in a cast, and it was healing very well, and would have healed completely without an operation. So I proposed that, instead of surgery, Mick rest and return to the World Championship for the second last race, hoping that his leg would be strong enough to win.
Dr. Costa's advice meant 8 weeks away from the championship, but Mick knew that with surgery, he'd be back on the track twice as fast.
He was taken off to hospital that afternoon, and I think by the next day, people were talking about him coming back in a month or, you know, and he had such a big points lead that he'd be able to come back, and even if he wasn't fully fit when he came back, he'd be able to get up to speed, and nobody had any doubt that he'd come back and win the title.
But what was a routine operation brought terrible complications. Mick's leg muscles swelled up and cut off the blood flow. He was rushed back into surgery at once.
The legs was dying, basically. I mean, it was actually dying. I mean, Mick said it smelt like a bad butcher's shop.
I'm sitting in a foreign hospital. I don't understand the language. I'm not getting much communication from the staff, let alone the doctors.
He was in constant contact with Dr. Costa, who by then was back in Italy. And when the doctors in Holland said, well, if we don't sort this out within the next 24 hours, we're going to have to amputate it, Mick obviously got pretty concerned then.
There were some serious complications. I got hold of an airplane and flew to Holland. I practically kidnapped Mick from the hospital and I brought him to Italy.
Strange as it may seem, the riders, they're all so keen to get back. You know, they're all desperately keen. All they want to do is get back. That they're quite happy to kind of undergo fairly extreme treatments to get them back on the track. But I think what Mick went through was probably more extreme than what anybody's done.
I just put a total 100% trust into Dr. Costa, really, and I knew that I wanted to get back. There was only one way we were going to achieve that.
In an intensive operation not for the feeble-minded, Mick's legs were sewn together.
È meno incredibile di quella che si può pensare.
It's not as incredible as one would think. I just took all the gangrene parts of the dying leg and attached them to large portions of tissue from the living leg. With the dying leg in contact with the living leg, the goodness could be shared.
Made life fairly interesting for 16 days, as you could imagine. But you know, it was something we had to do, and you know. Would I do it again? I don't know. I did it then.
After that long operation, I consoled Mick. He didn't ask me how the operation went. He didn't ask me what had happened. He only said, I want to race and conquer the World Championship.
When when he came back to racing at Brazil with 2 or 3 races left, he still couldn't walk. He was on crutches. And I mean, he was green, you know, his face was green. He was that kind of poorly.
Mick was back on the track within 6 weeks. It was an incredible sign of his determination, but this level of commitment would come at a price.
I felt that fate wasn't fair to Mick Doohan. It wasn't fair to be humiliated like that, considering all the risks he took and all the strength that he showed in trying to chase his dream.
I missed the World Championship by 4 points, which was a bit of a you know, looking back on it, I was very disappointed, but also looking back on it, it was also probably a godsend as well, because had I won the championship, I probably would have stopped.
Instead, Mick was determined to recover and held his sights on the World Championship. In what would become a phenomenal comeback, Mick had to reinvent the way he rode a motorcycle.
I'd lost the use of my foot, but I needed a rear brake, so I started riding and taking my thumb off to see actually how much I'm using the thing. I wasn't using it that much, so for the next race we'd modified it and we put a thumb-activated lever. And the rest is history, basically. Boring short story.
Mick finally became the world champion in 1994, a title which he held for an incredible 5 consecutive years.
For me, second, you've lost, you know, so second really didn't mean anything to me. So winning was what it was all about, and getting the most out of myself and out of the motorcycle.
But like so many riders before him, Mick was finally forced to retire after another devastating crash.
You don't see people walk away from this sport healthy generally. I know 2. Okay? 2 in the last 20 years who've walked away with virtually no serious injury.
All riders and drivers understand that the price of victory is based on the risks they're willing to take.
There's only 2 types of oval drivers, those that have hit the wall and those who are about to.
But for some, it is their death that becomes their legacy.
Oh no! Something went terribly wrong!
In motorsport, freak injuries will always occur. Today, scientists are working on those which are preventable.
To this day, head injuries are the #1 cause of fatality in all series of motorsports. So the head is kind of loose compared to the torso that's restrained in the car. The head and neck are allowed to kind of freely move around in the event of a crash.
Working to prevent disabling injuries, the engineers had found ways of better restraining the driver during impact. But this had created another problem.
When you restrain the torso heavily and the head whips, there are very high centrifugal forces developed that pull on the head and will either break your neck or break the base of the skull.
The reason for these high neck loads was eerily simple, and it was down to the duration the crash pulse lasts.
Today, what we're trying to understand with race car crash data is to try to simulate on our sled the actual crash that the actual race car had, because we can reproduce the acceleration now on the sled and we can find out what happened to that driver.
This 50-km/h velocity change sled test is comparable to a 200-km/h impact. When cars crash at these speeds, the damage occurs in milliseconds. And on our camera, these fatal forces are over in just 2 frames.
Contact at 260. Okay. Go ahead and single frame it to full extension. 50 milliseconds.
By analysing the crash millisecond by millisecond, the engineers can calculate the precise duration of the impact and thus the forces on the head.
That's it. 68 in. Now let's see him come out. Keep going.
The shorter the duration, the greater the risk to the driver.
135, he hits the bar on the far side. So that would be a full rebound sequence, about 135 milliseconds.
With the crash duration faster than the blink of an eye, the acceleration of the head is so great that, for the crash pulse period, the pressure on the head is greater than the weight of this car. Enough to cause the fatal injury known as a basilar skull fracture.
What happens in a race crash is the torso swings forward, and then the shoulders are restrained, and then the head continues to swing forward, and there's enough load between the head and neck, it actually breaks the base of the skull apart.
The basilar skull fracture is not a new type of injury. It's been around for centuries in the form of judicial hanging. But in race cars, it was a string of deaths in the NASCAR stock car series that was to thrust it into the spotlight.
In the summer of 2000, there were 3 drivers that were killed. Adam Petty, from the famous Richard Kyle Petty line, he had a right frontal crash, basilar skull fracture. Tony Roper, Kenny Irwin, similar crashes, both died of basilar skull fractures. So that in the summer of 2000, it became clear that there was a problem in stock car racing with basilar skull fracture causing death.
And then suddenly it sort of dawned on everybody, oh, that's what's happening. Everybody sort of began to realize that, and then they looked back and said, oh, this has been going on forever. It's a basic cause of death among race drivers.
In what became a controversial crusade to get stock car drivers to wear head restraints, the engineers concluded that the 3 NASCAR fatalities would have been prevented had the drivers worn a recently invented restraint system known as the Hans device.
The basic idea of the Hans device is to restrain the head so it directly resists the tendency for it to swing forward, and that needs to be done by having loads that go rearward through the middle of the head, and then those loads are transmitted down through the collar, and the whole thing is restrained with the body by the shoulder harness. So when the torso is restrained, the Hans device restrains the head right along with it.
The Ford and General Motors engineers come here to Indianapolis and they plead with the NASCAR drivers, start wearing the Hans device, it'll save your life. And they get almost deaf ears, and they find drivers say, oh, I don't necessarily believe that basal skull fracture stuff. Who ever heard of that stuff? You know, and here's some scientist. Who is this Dr. Robert Hubbard from Michigan State? You know, here's some egghead from some Yankee university, you know, coming down here telling us how to do things. And Earnhardt was pretty much the ringleader against it. He once referred to the Hans device as, quote, that damn noose.
Dale Earnhardt was a 7 times NASCAR champion and a legend to stock car fans across the United States. But he was a renegade when it came to safety, and to many, his opinions against the Hans epitomized the skepticism of the NASCAR community.
His common sense told him if you wore straps around your helmet and you got in a crash, it was going to hang you. So he referred to the Hans as the noose because he thought it was going to kill him rather than save him.
As soon as I realized that it was practical, that it would work, at that instant in time, I became a fanatic, quietly resolved to continue working on this thing until it was used commonly.
Despite the scientific evidence the engineers now provided, Earnhardt defied any changes in safety.
He sat right here in Indianapolis the August before he died in February, and he looked me in the eye, and with a lot of people present, he said, I'm comfortable the way I've got my stuff rigged. And he said, and I have not pulled my brain stem loose. And I've hit the wall many times. I have not pulled my brain stem loose. Exactly the words, and I looked him back in the eye, and my thought was, yet.
The Daytona 500 is NASCAR's legendary race, and Dale Earnhardt has won there many times. But as the cars turned into the final bend on February the 18th, 2001, Earnhardt was third, with his teammate Michael Waltrip in second, and his son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., leading. Earnhardt's job was to block the closest challengers, namely Sterling Marling and Rusty Wallace.
So here comes Rusty Wallace flying up the middle, totally legal move, totally legitimate, flying up right behind Earnhardt. Well, when he got up behind him, right before the entrance to turn 4, the aerodynamic effect was to Rusty's car ran up behind, took the downforce off the rear of Earnhardt's car.
This reconstruction of the accident shows Earnhardt's car starting to fishtail as its back end loses grip with the road. At this point, Sterling Marling makes his move. Earnhardt blocks and loses control.
Earnhardt's coming around the corner. He's stuck in a tight spot. Oh no! Something went terribly wrong!
This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements that I've ever personally had to make. But after the accident in turn 4 at the end of the Daytona 500, we've lost Dale Earnhardt.
There is still debate about exactly what went on inside the car, but what is certain is that the first impact from number 36 veered Earnhardt's car into a deadly trajectory angle with the wall. Racing drivers call this the 1 o'clock hit because it stops the car immediately.
Well, the Earnhardt crash is a complicated crash because it was a double hit. He was hit on the side and then he hit the wall. And the direction of the impact with the wall was such that his head went off to the right and missed the steering wheel.
Because Dale's body wasn't well restrained in the car, it developed a larger velocity difference between his torso and the chassis, so that when the restraint system finally did hold his body, then it was more violent, and of course his head was unrestrained, and it caused a more violent swinging forward, and he had a basilar skull fracture from this restrained torso, unrestrained head.
When it happens to Superman, you know, that's the way that we viewed Dale in this sport. He was our Superman, and if it can happen to him, sure, it can happen to anybody here. So we had to kind of, at that point in time, maybe take the bull by the horns and say, hey, this is a wake-up call, that something we should have been looking at before now, that we were a little slow in reacting. But I think that we've moved at a very rapid rate since that point in time.
6 months after Earnhardt's death, the HANS device was made compulsory in all NASCAR races.
If we would have just sat still and the safety measures wouldn't have gotten better from that point, then it would have been even more tragic. But we haven't. We've moved on, and I think that Dale will be very proud of what he could see with this sport right now.
We tested the HANS device just to see what it would take to destroy it, and the results were startling. After holding the equivalent of an incredible 160 G for over 500 times the crash pulse period, the device finally gave up.
Conceptually, there is no limit to the acceleration levels that the HANS device will help restrain the guy's head in a crash.
The HANS performance in real race car accidents is startling as well.
It went head on into the wall at about 210 miles an hour, and so, I mean, literally, I never lifted the throttle trace, just went like straight down. And
at a record impact force of 139 G, Richie Hearn's crash is the accelerometer's highest ever recorded impact.
The tub crushed, he broke his foot. No head or neck injuries.
I didn't have a headache, I didn't black out, nothing. I mean, I didn't have a mark on me except for my foot.
Rich's survival is true testament to the safety devices now implemented in all race cars, and a triumph for the scientists and medics who have dedicatedly worked to protect drivers over the last 3 decades.
Once you start collecting crash data in racing like this, you have to keep doing it. It's not the kind of thing that, well, we've learned everything we can learn about it, we can stop doing it. I think it's now become very obvious to the sanctioning bodies that it's something they're going to be doing for the rest of their active life.
When you have a Jimmy Clark or an Ayrton Senna or Dale Earnhardt die, and it really gets through that emotional barrier, I guess, we are all carrying around with us, and we think, God, you know, why didn't I see that before? You know, we need to do something, and something happens. And then we go on to the next plateau. But we're in the next denial stage now. We just haven't figured out quite where our next vulnerability is, but it's there.
The truth about what's under this farmhouse has never been revealed. Until now. Buried here is the world's biggest unexploded bomb. If detonated, it would destroy the farm, the road, and anybody who happened to be nearby. Nobody knew the bomb was there, least of all the farmer, until researchers found old records proving exactly where the 25 tons of explosives are hidden. At the end of a tunnel, 70 feet below ground. Why it's there is an astonishing story, a legacy of man's attempt to create the ultimate explosion. For more than 1,000 years, in war and peace, mankind has been refining the deadly and devastating science of explosives. No technology ever moved so far, so fast, ramping up explosive power 100,000 times over 50 years, leading ultimately to this.
It was without doubt the largest man-made detonation ever. The only other larger detonations have been caused by asteroid and meteor impact.
The nuclear bomb, harnessing particles too small to see, too fast to imagine, changed the course of history. But conventional explosives, from old-fashioned gunpowder to modern-day TNT, are still a potent force. How do they work? We'll experiment to see which are sensitive to impact, which are sensitive to heat, and we'll make an extraordinary journey deep underground, finding vivid proof that though explosives may lie buried, forgotten for decades, the danger doesn't diminish. The small Belgian town of Messines has a violent history. It was here during the First World War that the awesome power of explosives was demonstrated for the first time. This is the evidence. These are giant craters now filled by rainwater left by a single, quite extraordinary act of war. 1 million pounds of explosives buried deep underground was detonated, killing 10,000 unsuspecting soldiers. It was the bloodiest 30 seconds in the whole history of armed combat.
It was quite unique. There'd never been so much explosive in a small area before in history.
The plan was born out of desperation. By 1916, World War I had reached stalemate, a killing contest waged from static positions. Messines was a key objective for the British because of one unique feature: the ridge which dominates the Belgian flatlands. The British, marked blue, were on the lower slope of Messines Ridge. They looked up at an enemy in an impregnable position. Thousands of young men had been slaughtered trying to capture the commanding heights. Was there nothing they could do to break through the German defences? The British were being pounded into defeat at Messines. Until one of the oldest of military stratagems promised a way out of their dilemma.
You had trench lines that in many cases were very close together. And you have a situation that's closely akin to, in effect, siege operations. It didn't take very long for the old-fashioned siege techniques of digging underneath and attacking them from below by trying to blow the enemy defences to take hold.
Suddenly, a new kind of warrior began to appear on, or at least under, the Western Front. Their weapons weren't rifles, but picks and shovels. And though the idea was borrowed from ancient history, this plan would be on a scale so large it's hard to imagine. The British aimed to secretly dig a whole network of tunnels to where the German trenches lay. At the end of each tunnel, they would build a chamber. Into these chambers, they planned to pile huge quantities of a brand new, powerful explosive called ammonal. 40,000 sacks of it, each weighing 25 pounds, would be dragged into place. The plan would take a year to complete. But after that time, 1 million pounds of explosives would be in position. The largest quantity ever in one place, directly below the German army, ready to erupt. The British commanders who devised the plan at Messines demanded the new explosive ammonal. Soon the first shipments began to arrive. Ammonal has special characteristics ideally suited to mine warfare.
It has a powerful lifting effect. It's a slow burning explosive, and therefore it moves things rather than cuts into them with heat.
Ammonal was designed for just this task, though the principle behind all chemical explosives is exactly the same.
This is black powder, also known as gunpowder, the oldest known explosive, originally invented by the Chinese well over 1,000 years ago. And I'm laying it out here in a nice loose heap with no confinement whatsoever.
The powder is just heaped in a pile with nothing to contain it.
We need a way to set off the black powder. What I'm going to do is put this delay fuse into the charge, set fire to it, and it will give me time to walk to a safe distance before the charge goes off.
The powder simply burns, releasing smoke and hot gases harmlessly. Burning like this is called deflagration as opposed to detonation. What would happen if those gases couldn't escape? Here's the same amount of gunpowder in a cardboard tube. This time, a powerful explosion. The gases had nowhere to go, pressure built up, and the same would happen, but on a giant scale at Messines. The ammonal would be tightly confined in the mine chambers, and its ingredients make it 3 times more powerful than gunpowder.
Ammonal is basically about 2/3 ammonium nitrate, the remaining third consisting of a mix of TNT, aluminium and a certain amount of charcoal.
So, just how powerful is it? We'll detonate 4.5 kilos, about 9 pounds. At Messines, each individual mine was as large as 90,000 pounds. Once the charge is primed, only the expert and a remote camera are allowed to be this close. The minimum safe distance for this explosion, 1,000 feet away. The firing circuit must be checked, and then...
Stand by for firing! Firing! Now!
Debris is thrown 100 feet into the air and takes a little while to come down. So how much damage will our own miniature mine have caused?
This is the effect of just 4.5 kilos. The charges during the First World War were 10,000 times bigger than this.
The British hoped that this, magnified thousands of times, would wipe out an entire German army.
The British wanted to cause the biggest explosion the world has known up till that moment. Not just to blow the Germans into the air, but to cause an artificial earthquake, a psychological shock to the defenders.
The British were counting on the element of surprise, but how could they keep such a vast undertaking secret?
50,000 men engaged in mining, and the logistic effort was enormous. So the timber needed, the explosives, the special equipment, etc.
The existence of the tunnels was kept secret even from the British troops, in case they were captured and questioned. But the greatest security threat wasn't from German interrogators, but from the local geology. Deep down, the tunnellers were cutting through what's called blue clay, and tens of thousands of tons of it had to be brought up to the surface.
Blue clay was very different from the brown surface soil. The German aerial observation went over every day, and they could see the places where actually the blue clay was concentrated. And then they know these are the places where they were digging.
To protect the secret, every last shovelful of blue clay had to be loaded into sandbags, then carried away from the front line under cover of darkness.
They would put it into shell holes, cover over the top with topsoil, or use it to fill up old dugouts that weren't needed. But they had to hide it.
Finally, with the Germans very close to discovering the secret, the warren of mineshafts was complete. All the mines would be detonated at the same instant. Then the troops would charge forward to the top of Messines Ridge. Nothing was left to chance. Like 21st century battle commanders, British generals even ordered a full-scale model of Messines for the troops to study. They ordered 100,000 soldiers up to the front line and a massive artillery barrage to pound the German trenches right into the night before the attack. As dawn approached, firing cables were laid, detonators connected.
Fix bayonets.
Troops prepared to go over the top. The mines would be detonated at exactly 10 minutes past 3.
All charges prime, sir. There you go.
Just before 0 hour, the barrage ceased. In the deadly routine of the Western Front, the Germans thought they knew what was coming next. Troops rushed to their trenches, from dugouts where they'd been sheltering, to repel the expected infantry charge. This time, the pause was a trick. Their trenches were directly on top of the mines. As silence descended, the eerie calm seemed more terrifying than the cacophony of battle. As the last seconds ticked away, there rose a sound never heard before on the front line. A dawn chorus of birdsong.
It must have been something incredible. The whole ridge was one huge flame, like a big mushroom, which went open and then which exploded.
The military authorities really didn't know what the effect of blowing so much explosive at the same time might be. It registered as an earthquake in Switzerland. There were genuine fears that it might cause some kind of rift.
It had completely shattered the German ability to resist.
The attacking troops within the first couple of hours had gained the main German defences. It was a striking success.
Where the German trenches had been, now there were just craters and 10,000 bodies. For the British, though, now the masters of Messines Ridge, it was time to celebrate. But in that moment of triumph, there was one thing they failed to consider. Had all the mines that were planted gone off? several decades would pass before that question was answered. It was a sultry summer's evening in 1955 when the storm finally broke over Messines village. It wakened memories of days gone by, when the roar of giant guns rocked the town. It also awakened something more sinister. What could have caused an explosion on this scale? What had been a cornfield was now a massive hole, 60 feet deep, 200 feet wide.
We're actually at the spot here where on the 17th of July 1955, one of the 4 forgotten mines of Messines have exploded. It caused a huge crater between here and these houses in the distance. For the whole village, it must have been an enormous shock.
The crater has since been filled, but it's easy to see how close it came to wiping out these houses. The lightning had struck one of these poles, which flashed the charge underground to the buried explosives. Amazingly, no one was hurt. Villagers thought this was a 1 in a million freak occurrence. But now experts have discovered long-forgotten battle plans. And there's bad news.
There are 3 others. There's one behind us in the field, one in that direction, and one here in front of us. It was an immense crater in 1955. If the 3 others would come to a simultaneous explosion, I think it would be a real catastrophe here.
The British attack at Messines heralded a new kind of warfare, killing on an industrial scale, only made possible by new and more powerful explosives. As well as ammonal, TNT first appeared during this war, invented in Germany, but quickly adopted as a standard explosive for shells by all armies. The generals demanded TNT in vast quantities. It was more powerful, yet safer to handle than earlier generations of explosives. Even so, just 6 months after the Battle of Messines, feeding that appetite for TNT led to the biggest unplanned explosion of all time. The sea in this part of the world is everything. For Halifax, Nova Scotia, a deep-water harbour on Canada's eastern seaboard, ships are the city's livelihood. But one ship in particular nearly spelled the death of Halifax, proving that where there are explosives, danger is never far away.
The Halifax explosion is the largest prior to the atomic bombs. There's no explosion prior to 1945 that matches it.
During the First World War, Halifax played a vital role in sending explosives and other war materials from North America to the Western Front. Many of the explosives used at Messines passed through here. Halifax harbour approaches were always crowded with shipping. On December the 6th, 1917, on the French steamer Mont Blanc, a huge shipment of raw TNT and other explosives had been crammed aboard. Her skipper expected another routine Atlantic crossing. But then... Captain! Another steamer, the Emo, was approaching fast on a collision course.
Mont Blanc was coming from the open ocean, proceeding up the harbour. Emo had been in the Bedford Basin at anchor, ready to go out to sea.
A collision would be bad enough, but the Mont Blanc on the right was a giant floating bomb.
Mont Blanc was loaded with 2.9 kilotons. That's 2,900 tons of explosives. Everything from picric acid used for making munitions to gun cotton to the new explosive 200 tons of TNT.
Even loaded stem to stern with explosives, Mont Blanc had survived the impact. How?
The cocktail of explosives that were on board the Mont Blanc may seem quite horrendous to the layman. However, explosives need to be insensitive, otherwise you can't transport them around, and if you can't transport them around, you can't use them.
What does happen when high explosive TNT, exactly the same as on Mont Blanc, is subjected to massive impact? In this experiment, we'll find out. This is 0.5 kilogram of TNT, enough to demolish a house. The Mont Blanc was specially designed as an explosives carrier. Her hold was lined with wood to prevent sparks. We'll also avoid direct contact with the metal weight. The weight is more than 400 pounds. It'll be released by a small explosive charge cutting the rope. Dropped from a height of 10 metres, the weight will strike with a crushing force of 6,000 tons. A tiny remote camera will capture the moment of impact, if it survives.
Firing now!
The weight crashes down, but the TNT is just turned to dust. It's reacted exactly as it was designed to do.
You have primary high explosives, which are very easy to set off, and secondaries, which are difficult. TNT is a secondary high explosive. You can drop a considerable weight onto it, and it still won't go off. The reason you want to have secondary high explosives is that you don't want an explosive that goes off by accident when you don't want it to.
Just like on that morning at Halifax. Mont Blanc survived the impact, but a tragic chain of events had begun.
The Mont Blanc, unfortunately, did not blow up. She drifted.
Above the TNT, 30 tons of benzol, similar to petrol. Sparks had showered from the grinding metal of Mont Blanc's torn hull.
The fire raged in the benzol, and eventually the heat got down into the cargo.
The crew of Mont Blanc knew what was coming. The only question, when? They raced to abandon the blazing ship, leaving her to drift across the harbour towards Halifax City.
That 15-minute delay made it particularly tragic for the population in Halifax. You can imagine, with the ship burning in the harbor, everyone in Halifax lined the hill, stood there, stopped, and watched.
The blazing vessel was drifting to precisely where she'd do the most damage. But with the fire on board now an inferno, why didn't she explode? Another experiment will provide the answer. We'll create a fierce blaze using kerosene as the fuel. And here's another 0.5 kilo of raw TNT, like the 200 tons on board Mont Blanc. This time, the TNT is about to be cooked. For safety reasons, a remote detonator will ignite the fire.
Firing now!
But will the heat of the fire set off the explosive? After 3 minutes, it's an inferno. But you can see the TNT, one of the most powerful of modern explosives, simply burning.
TNT, like other secondary explosives, requires a very heavy shockwave in order to set it off. You need a detonator, which gives it a really hard smack. When it's put in a fire, there's no shockwave produced, so it will not go off.
The thousands of tons of raw explosives on Mont Blanc might just have burnt out harmlessly like this. There might have been no disaster, but for a final and fatal piece of the jigsaw. The Mont Blanc had been blazing for 15 minutes. She was now right alongside the crowded shoreline of Halifax Harbour, and her cargo included a quantity of artillery shells. The detonators inside the shells were exactly what was needed to trigger the raw TNT. It's easy to imagine the excitement in the crowds there watching, with no idea of the danger they were in.
Only people that have experienced something like the Blitz can have any concept of how absolute the destruction was. That explosion wave swept up the hill and totally obliterated every house, every family that was there. The blast wave shattered the houses. And then there was also a tsunami or a tidal wave. Perhaps as many as 200 people were drowned, but we don't know what caused the death of many people. We just had too many bodies to do autopsies.
The death toll, around 2,000, is still only an estimate.
It was not possible to identify everyone. Some of the bodies were simply a bundle of incinerated bones. It wasn't even possible to know if it was one body or two. Some were left headless. One body was found 18 months later in the ruins of a building.
The crew of Mont Blanc did survive. They'd rowed to shore and laid flat down in a belt of trees. But of their ship, nothing was left except this section of anchor weighing half a ton, thrown 2 miles south. And this heavy gun tossed 3 miles through the air in the other direction. They are a reminder of the astonishing forces unleashed that day. And the significance of this disaster wasn't lost on generals and scientists who, come the next war, pondered how to destroy whole cities. Not by accident, but by design.
Halifax became a proving ground for some of the theories that were going to be used in designing that atomic bomb for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, when you look at those newsreel photos, there is a very eerie similarity between what Japan experienced and what we experienced.
Only one generation had passed when, in 1939, conflict again engulfed the world. As in every war, it was the fighting men who pulled the triggers, fired the shells, released the bombs. But as this war advanced, whole armies of scientists were recruited too. Their orders were to conquer the new realm of nuclear physics. German scientists realized the military potential of nuclear energy, triggering a race with the Allies to build the first atom bomb. As the fortunes of war swayed back and forth, the key battleground was in top-secret laboratories. What now sounds like elementary physics was a formula which could win the war. When a particle called a neutron strikes an atom of uranium, 2 more neutrons are released. Vast energies produced and then multiplied. In a time span almost too short to measure, there's a chain reaction. The proving ground for this theory, promising unlimited explosive power, would be here in New Mexico. In 1943, the world's most brilliant physicists were gathered in the utmost secrecy at a place called Los Alamos. They understood the science of the atom bomb, but what would it do to the enemy?
We were looking to use these in combat situations, and it was thus necessary to know what this energy release would do to targets.
The scientists staged experiments with large quantities of conventional explosives. This is what 100 tons of TNT looks like piled up at the New Mexico test site. It's less than 5% of the explosives which went off in the Halifax disaster. But when it blew up, the fireball was visible for 60 miles. The chief scientist at Los Alamos was J. Robert Oppenheimer. He and his team had also been studying existing data in the file marked disasters.
Oppenheimer and others actually conducted a mini history lesson to see what an atomic bomb might look like. And the first very large detonation was, of course, the 1917 Halifax explosion.
Why was this one so devastating? The scientists noticed something called the Mach stem effect.
The Mach stem effect is basically the reflected shock wave coming off the ground and merging with the shock wave in the air for an enhanced, powerful blast wave.
Because a ship is above the Earth's surface, an explosion shock wave shoots down as well as up. It's reflected and magnified. Scientists saw that this could make an atom bomb more devastating too.
That ultimately led to the decision to have the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both those bombs were air blasts, i.e. above the ground, as opposed to a ground blast, and they therefore did more damage and caused more loss of life than if they'd been a ground blast.
As scientists neared the day when they would test their theory, there was shocking confirmation of their predictions. Almost as if fate had ordered another experiment on a huge and tragic scale. Look down from California's Mount Diablo, Devil Mountain, and you'll see an extraordinary piece of history. Lying just off the US Navy base known as Port Chicago, what they call the Mothball Navy. Warships, many from World War II, rusting at anchor. In the war, the ships had plenty to do. Port Chicago handled huge quantities of explosives, brought in by rail, then loaded on supply ships, destined for the war in the Pacific. On July 17th, 1944, one of these supply ships, the E.A. Bryan, took its turn at the dockside. Loading the explosives was a punishing business. The dock workers, all of them black enlisted men, were under extreme pressure to make a rapid turnaround.
That night, the E.A. Bryan was receiving cluster bombs, depth charges, and incendiary bombs. And it's interesting to note that the incendiary bombs were what we would call hot, that is, they were fused, ready to go into action, could be tripped at any moment.
With 4,000 tons already aboard, 500 more on the dockside, and the men rushing to finish, something cataclysmic happened.
It was massive. That pillar of cloud rose over 2 miles above the earth. The state capital, Sacramento, about 70 miles north, felt it. People in Nevada, 200 to 300 miles away on the other side of a massive mountain range, felt the concussive seismic force of it.
In a few seconds, Port Chicago had become a wasteland. Dockside buildings had been turned to matchwood. The ship had vanished. All but these 2 chunks of the keel and hundreds of smaller pieces scattered over 5 square miles. 320 sailors were killed.
Body parts were found in various places. In fact, along one wire fence, skin of a human's face with the eyes, nose, and mouth holes clearly discernible was located and, of course, had to be removed.
What caused the blast is still unknown. An accident in handling the live munitions was judged most likely, but scientists were less interested in the cause of the explosion than the effects.
Port Chicago was of interest to the scientists at Los Alamos because it proved to be a model for what an atomic bomb might look like.
The Los Alamos Director of Weapons, US Navy Captain William Parsons, was ordered to make careful measurements of the destruction and then present a report on what he'd learned.
What they were able to calculate at Port Chicago very effectively was the effect of terrain and other impediments that get in the way of a blast wave. There were actually survivors of this blast, very close in, who normally you would think would have been killed, who were shielded by structures and managed to survive.
The column of fire rose.
The data confirmed that if the point of explosion had been higher above the ground, the shockwave would have been more widespread.
The second thing was how far away from the burst you had to keep the air crew so that they could survive.
An aircraft flying overhead that night at 9,000 feet reports chunks of metal the sizes of small homes or garages flying past.
The problem of how to escape alive was of special interest to Captain Parsons. He had been selected as one of the flight crew who had dropped the world's first atom bomb. That day came on August the 6th, 1945. And the lessons learned from both Halifax and Port Chicago would be put into effect. The bomb was dropped from 30,000 feet, giving the crew time to escape. It had been set to detonate 2,000 feet above the ground to maximize its destructive power. In the explosion itself, and from the after effects, 140,000 people died. After a second bomb was exploded over the city of Nagasaki 3 days later, Japan finally surrendered. Now the world knew the awesome power of America's atom bomb, but before long even this would be overshadowed by the ultimate explosion of all time.
The order of magnitude is almost incomprehensible, but one way you can look at it is that the bomb dropped by the Soviets was on the order of 6,000 Hiroshimas, all in one shot.
It was on this frozen desert island, in the most dangerous period of the Cold War, that the ultimate explosion took place. Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic Barents Sea is where the Russians demonstrated their nuclear might, testing bombs of ever-increasing power. On October the 30th, 1961, they pushed the limits of explosive power further than they'd ever gone, or will probably ever go again. This bomb was codenamed the Tsar. It contained the equivalent of 58 million tons of TNT, or all the explosives used in World War II, multiplied by 10. The science of bomb making had changed radically since the first atomic test in New Mexico in 1945.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Early atom bombs like this worked through what's called nuclear fission. Hydrogen bombs use a still more powerful process known as fusion. Inside an H-bomb, an initial atomic explosion is used to force together isotopes of hydrogen. The pressure's so great that the atoms fuse, releasing enormous energy.
With an atom bomb, there is a practical upper limit where you can only put in so much fuel before it would just self-destruct from pre-detonation. There's no theoretical upper limit on how big a hydrogen bomb can be.
Although beaten to build the first atom bomb, Russia caught up, then overtook America in building ever bigger hydrogen bombs. The Tsar, the biggest bomb, the most powerful device mankind has ever constructed, was to be their masterpiece. And a political showpiece too. 6 camera crews were assigned to film this unique moment in history. The aircrew were hand-picked. They'd been warned their safety couldn't be guaranteed. They could avoid being blinded by the light, but being knocked out of the sky was quite possible. The exact moment of release was controlled from the ground. The bomb had been given a parachute to slow its descent and give the crew more time to escape. They did escape, but only just. The plume rose right through the cloud layer and kept on rising. It flattened out when the cloud was 40 miles high. The blast wave was still large enough to be measured on its third passage round the world. Because the bomb was detonated 2 miles above the ground, there was very little radioactive fallout. But the earth directly below the burst was seared by the intense heat. Rock had been turned to ash. The bomb was 4 times bigger than anything America has ever exploded. Why something so large?
The United States could develop very accurate missiles. The Soviets never mastered that technique very well, and to compensate for that, they really could level a very large area and take out their intended target without having to actually hit the target itself.
Aimed at a target the size of London, here's what would happen. The blast wave would obliterate everything in a circle 30 miles wide. The fireball would be 110 miles across, incinerating everything in its path. A similar device aimed at Washington would cause equally widespread blast, fire, and radiation effects. The likely death toll in the tens of millions. But why did the quest for ever bigger bombs suddenly cease?
As the destructive power increased, political leaders worried more and more that they were really playing with fire.
In 1963, the superpowers banned bomb tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space.
I think that the Soviet detonation will probably be the biggest ever man-made detonation in the future as well.
And so the soldiers and scientists have packed up and flown away. This island's days as a bomb site are history. But history has a way of returning to haunt us, nowhere more so than the World War I battlefield of Messine Ridge. The explosion of June the 7th, 1917, huge though it was, now pales in comparison to those of the following decades. But it's here that history won't release its grip, ensuring real and present danger. Just how many unexploded mines remained was one of the enduring mysteries from the First World War. Most history books said 2, but now those books will have to be revised. A careful study of old battle plans and war diaries has revealed 4, maybe more. And these are mines which are primed to explode. They could be touched off by nothing more than bad weather. A cluster of mines is in an area the British codenamed Birdcage. These weren't blown on the day of the attack because the front line had shifted after the mines were placed.
Then, when the Germans attacked in that area in 1918, they were lost, or the positions were lost.
Lost and entirely forgotten until one was struck by lightning in 1955, leaving the other 3 still armed and dangerous.
They are in open fields, but of course people could be walking across those fields.
The biggest mine of all is the most menacing. The 25 tons of explosives sitting underneath this farmhouse, known as Petit Douve. The mine's firing mechanism was damaged before the day of the attack, and it was abandoned.
The Petit Douve mine was a big charge. In the event of it going off, the farmhouse would disappear. Whether they are aware of it, I've no idea, but I suspect not.
But now they know the explosives are there, why don't they remove them? A journey deep underground will show how difficult that would be. Just across the French border at Vimy, the British also planted mines. they're on a much smaller scale. Explosives experts, known as the Durand Group, who tracked down the lost mines of Messines, have been investigating underground here. Though the clay tunnels of Messines will now have flooded and all the tunnels collapsed, these, cut in hard chalk, are still accessible, just about. At the end of this tunnel, 25 minutes from the surface, lie 4,000 pounds of explosive. Exactly the same as at Messines.
What you're looking at are bags of ammonal. That's the explosives they used. These are rubberized bags, clipped at the top and relatively waterproof. By and large, the contents are still quite viable. As far as the Messines mines go, they will be completely flooded. The flooding in the tunnels would actually help to preserve the mines. So the probability is that even to this day, most of the explosives that are left there are still in good condition.
The flooding will have created an oxygen-free environment, preserving what's inside.
The detonators might deteriorate, and what we don't know is whether, in fact, they might become more sensitive with time as opposed to less sensitive. And then if you had a lightning strike in the vicinity, static electricity could induce a current in the cable to fire the charge.
To learn that your home is on top of the world's biggest unexploded bomb is news that's difficult to take in. For farmer Roger Mailleur, whose family have been here for generations, there's not much he can do about it.
I just asked the farmer what he thinks about the 50,000 pounds of ammonal, which is still under the soil here. And he says, yeah, well, that you have to live with such a thing. In 1955, when the mine exploded, he has heard that here, and there was a big trickling of the earth, and that's quite a few kilometers away. Yeah.
Maybe it's just that in this part of the world, you get used to living in the shadow of history. Reminders of war, and especially man striving for the ultimate explosion, are everywhere. This is where the German victims of Messines are buried. The plaques reveal how devastating the mines were, claiming 10,000 lives on June the 7th, 1917. Will the mines that lie buried stay silent? Now that, nobody can say. In modern warfare, air superiority is essential. To control the skies, air forces have built the most highly evolved military machines ever made. Strike planes that can deliver lethal force anywhere, anytime. Now designers are creating a new breed of strike planes that will be able to carry out their mission with unparalleled superiority. These new generation aircraft will be faster, deadlier and stealthier than ever before. This plane, the F-15 Eagle, was built for one purpose and one purpose only: total air superiority. It was created to combat the threat posed by the Soviet MiG fighters during the height of the Cold War in the 70s, and was the first strike plane that could detect and kill from many miles away, as well as engage in dogfights. It's still in operation today, and in 30 years of active service, it has never been beaten in air-to-air combat. It's the benchmark by which all modern strike planes are judged. The F-15 saw active service in both Gulf Wars and is now keeping the peace patrolling the skies above the west coast of America, with the Oregon Air National Guard constantly on the lookout for any threat to the US's national security.
I'm Mo Gass, a major in the Oregon Air National Guard, and I fly the F-15.
My name is Paul Fitzgerald. I'm an F-15 pilot for the Oregon Air National Guard.
Former airline pilots Major Dale Bennett, known as Mogas, and Major Paul Fitzgerald, known as Snap, have been stationed at the Air National Guard for 3 years. They are on alert night and day and maintain their readiness with regular training sorties in their F-15s.
The F-15 is a pretty incredible airplane, actually. Thinking about its design was in the late 50s, 60s. Came off the production line in the mid-70s, so it's been around for quite some time. It's a pretty powerful airplane. It was actually built to rule the skies and strictly in an air superiority type of a role, and it has not lost in battle yet, and I don't think it's going to lose anytime soon.
The F-15 comes in 4 versions, including a bomber, but the most successful is the air-to-air combat fighter, like those flown by Mogas and Snap.
It's a pretty big airplane. It was actually built to house the radar that lives in the nose. The airplane is about 43 feet tall, about 63, 64 feet long, and at the tail it's just under 20 feet high. So it's a pretty large airplane. It's been akin to the size of a tennis court.
As well as patrolling the skies for intruders, the pilots of the Air National Guard also carry out training exercises. Mogas and Snap are planning a simulated dogfight where they will practice locking their weapon systems onto each other.
Objectives for the Blue Air is quick kill.
Being a frontline fighter pilot is a hazardous job. Every time they fly, they may encounter the enemy and have to deploy lethal force.
My mission then is to turn them into hair, teeth, and eyeballs. Realistically, it's kill or be killed. And fortunately, I think all of us have resolved ourselves to the fact that you're taking out the other guy's airplane. If he has a good ejection seat, then it's a good day for him. If he doesn't have a good ejection seat, then that's one of the dangers and the threats that we live with.
The F-15 was the first strike plane with the ability to take out an opponent up close or from miles away.
We have 2 arenas we normally fight in. It's within visual range and then, of course, beyond visual range. Within visual range, I have a 20-millimeter cannon that's in the right wing root of the airplane. Once you start moving into a little bit further out into miles and so, we'd start talking about the heat-seeking missile. And then once you get beyond that range, now you start talking about the advanced medium-range air-to-air missile that we use, otherwise known as the AMRAAM.
The real benefit of the AMRAAM is its ability to really get out there and reach out and touch someone and turn them into pieces and parts.
The F-15 has 2 giant engines producing a combined thrust of 46,900 pounds between them, capable of pushing the plane to a top speed of 3,000 kilometers an hour.
The thrust that you get out of these airplanes gets you off the ground fast and gets you to where you need to get fast.
The biggest advantage having a great thrust-to-weight ratio is the ability to power through a turn and to not only turn as quick as you can, but also to be able to sustain that turn in combat. It might take, in order to kill the enemy, it might take 3 or 4 360-degree turns in order to successfully get behind them and get into a weapons engagement zone and to either shoot a missile off or to shoot the gun.
But turning at high speeds exerts massive pressure known as G-force on the pilot, 1G being the force of normal gravity.
There's 5. There's 6.
When the pilot makes a high G turn, the weight of their body is multiplied by the same number.
6.5 right there.
At 6.5 Gs, a 76-kilogram pilot would feel as if he weighed 6.5 times as much, nearly 500 kilograms.
In order to be able to cope with the 9 Gs that the airplane will pull and actually sustain for a little bit of time, they give us several different pieces of equipment to help that happen. That's the combat edge vest. It fills up with air, keeps the internal pressure in your chest cavity, so the blood can actually get pushed out of your chest cavity and into your head. Most important is your G pants too, G suit otherwise known as. It tightens up. It also moves the blood from your lower extremities into your chest, and obviously to try to keep the blood in your head so that you can keep blood in your eyes so that you can see and think. The color goes out of your vision first. The second thing that goes is obviously you have tunnel vision, and then it's followed by stages of going unconscious, and that's the whole reason we're trying to avoid that. You don't want to be manipulating the controls of an airplane when you're unconscious.
The pilots also wear a helmet with an oxygen mask in case the cockpit were to depressurise at high altitude. But the F-15 is getting old. During every flight, the ageing aircraft perform extreme manoeuvres and put the airframe under enormous stress. As a result, the planes require constant maintenance. It takes more than just a pilot to run an F-15. Behind the scenes is a team of over 30 highly skilled personnel just to keep each plane in the air. The precise age of the plane determines the level of maintenance required.
This airplane is 20 years old, and with that, the unique challenges are that the metal is always going under a tremendous amount of stress, and it wasn't designed to last as long as it has. But we continually x-ray all the metal parts, and on an hourly inspection cycle, highly scrutinize the airplane for metal fatigue, and even the engines for any possible signs of wear and tear that might make or indicate there could be a problem in flight.
For every hour in flight, the plane requires at least 10 hours of maintenance, including engine testing here in the Hush House. A team of engineers can remove an engine from a plane and have it in the test facility in under an hour. The skill of the maintenance team ensures that the planes are airworthy when pilots Mogas and Snap go out on exercises. No pilot wants mechanical failure when engaging the enemy at 10,000 metres. F-15 pilots Mogas and Snap from the Oregon Air National Guard are going on a dogfight training exercise. They are going to simulate shooting an intruder out of the sky by locking on to each other in a mock dogfight. Before the flight, each pilot carries out one final check to make sure that his plane is airworthy. The F-15 first flew in 1972. Over 1,200 were built, and now there are still over 500 flying on active duty.
You have an airplane that's been around for 30 years, and still there's countries out there that are still trying to build airplanes to counter this airplane specifically. And I think that's attributed to the continual attention this airplane's been given over the years to keep it at cutting edge.
Mogas 1 and 2, AB climb to 15,000 is approved. Departure end cable indicates up. Wind 260 at 6, runway 28 left, clear for takeoff, change to departure.
Mogas 1 clear for takeoff with quick climb, and say again the freak for departure.
Departure frequency 299.2 for Mogas 1 and 2.
2992 for Mogas, Mogas push 9.
By the time you get down to the end of the runway, you're doing 300, 400, 500 miles an hour, and then you can basically just take off straight up into the air. It's quite a sensation. It's like being on the tip of a rocket.
By the time you reach the end of the runway, your gear's up, your flaps are up, and you're ready to pull. You go straight up in the air. You're ready to pull a nice 7G turn straight up to go vertically. And you can get up in a hurry that way. It'll certainly wake you up in the morning.
The afterburners can push the F-15 to 5,000 metres. That's 5 kilometres up in the sky in less than a minute, reaching twice the speed of sound, but at a cost.
Anytime you use afterburners, you're going to increase your IR or your infrared or your heat signature.
The infrared or heat exhaust signature makes the F-15 vulnerable to heat-seeking missiles fired from the ground or enemy planes.
You're also using a heck of a lot more gas because it's raw fuel in order to get that afterburner working. So you have a fuel disadvantage by having to use it, and obviously you have a heat signature disadvantage.
Once they reach 10,000 metres, Mogas and Snap start their dogfight training exercise. They take turns being the hunter and the hunted. One plane acts out the role of the enemy, while the other chases and attempts to lock on its weapons guidance systems. Once the hunter plane locks on, he registers a kill.
And there's a gun strike kill right there.
A strike for Mogas. Had this been a real intruder, they'd now be nothing more than charred metal and smoke. Even though the F-15 is well past its shelf life, it will continue to be the US Air Force's premier air-to-air strike fighter until its successor comes into service in 10 years' time.
I believe it still does rule the skies. There's specific airplanes that do other things probably a little better, but when you take the overall package and you talk about the overall airplane, it's still a top contender in the world and probably will continue to be until we bring the new one online.
A beautiful airplane. I don't think that in the history of mankind, I don't think we will ever build a more beautiful airplane, and it's just a real joy to fly.
The F-15 has proved itself in combat time and time again, but it does have one huge disadvantage. Because of its size and weight, it requires a 2.5 kilometre long runway. And this means that it can't operate from small airfields close to the battlefield. This problem was cracked by the British when they came up with the Harrier jump jet, a plane that needs no runway at all. It can do things that no other in-service jet plane can perform. It can take off vertically. It can take off with a short runway. It can even hover. Built originally in the 1960s, the Harrier jump jet revolutionised fighter plane design. Over 800 Harriers have been in service around the globe, taking off from land and sea.
My name's Squadron Leader Jim Provost. I'm a Harrier pilot on one squadron. I've been flying for approximately 12 years, and I joined the Harrier in 1994. The Harrier concept came about many, many years ago during the Cold War. Its design was to be able to take off from very short surfaces, to land vertically in case there were no runways to make use of. And we're talking about a concept that was in the 50s, and yet it's still going into the 21st century. What makes the Harrier special is the fact that it can land vertically. It can land on a ship, it can land in a clearing in a wood, which makes it very special.
The reason that the Harrier can perform these incredible manoeuvres is its extraordinary engine system. There are 2 air intakes, but only one powerful Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine.
First point to note is that there's only one engine on the Harrier. People often make the mistake of thinking that there are 4, but there aren't. You see through the intake here, there's the Pegasus engine. It's a big engine and provides all of the thrust for the aircraft. If we look down the right-hand side, we can see what we call the nozzles. We've got a hot nozzle at the back here and a cold nozzle at the front. Same on both sides, so we have 4 nozzles that take the thrust from the one engine. What that does, it provides normal thrust for forward flight, just like any other fast jet. And if we bring the nozzles down, which you can control from the cockpit, that gives you your thrust for your vertical landings and your vertical takeoff.
The plane's entire weight is balanced on the downward thrust of its engine.
When the Harrier comes to the hover, obviously most of the thrust goes from the engine to the 4 nozzles on the fuselage. What we need to do once it's in the hover is control it. The way we do that is by diverting some of the thrust to the puffer ducts, as we call them. We have puffer ducts in the wingtips, puffer ducts in the tail, and also the nose. And what that does is provide control in all axes whilst it's in the hover. If you didn't have that, then the aircraft would just fall out of the sky. It'd be on a pillar of thrust, and you'd not be able to control the roll or the pitch or the yaw.
By blasting small amounts of thrust out of these puffer ducts, the pilot can balance the plane in hover and can even use them to perform delicate manoeuvres. He can even get it to fly backwards. But if the Harrier is fully loaded with weapons and fuel, it hasn't enough thrust to take off vertically, so it uses a traditional takeoff, but with a much shorter run, just 450 metres. When hovering, the Harrier needs constant pilot input. This is particularly true when operating from an aircraft carrier.
The thing can't hover and land by itself, so there's lots of things that the pilot needs to do. He's got to be able to manoeuvre the aircraft safely over a very small area and be able to land it. So there is a lot of pilot input that you don't get on other aircraft types. This is the Harrier cockpit. It's I think it's fairly basic, but I guess to people looking at it, it seems fairly complicated. Once you know your way around it, it's actually fairly simple. What it has, standard stick for fast jet, and it's designed very much to be a hands-on throttle and stick, so you don't take your hands away from that very often. One control that the Harrier has that other fast jets don't have is this control just by my left thigh, which is the nozzle control. Which is obviously a very fundamental part of how the Harrier flies. Very small control, but apart from the stick and the throttle, that's probably the most important control in the aeroplane. Harrier can go anywhere in the world. It can operate from almost any terrain. It's proved itself in desert warfare, temperate climates, the Arctic. It can also operate from the ship. It can land on almost any surface, and it can carry a large weapon load. We can compete with the very best. We can go a long way, we can go very high, and we can bring precision weapons, which is where warfare is, to the fight.
Like the F-15, the Harrier is getting old, and by modern standards requires a huge amount of pilot input just to keep the plane in the air when they should be concentrating on the enemy. Also, its inability to go supersonic could put it at a disadvantage when up against faster jets. The solution is the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, the only aircraft in the world that is both supersonic and capable of vertical takeoff and landing. The plane is still in development, but its designers firmly believe it represents the future of strike aircraft.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Art Tomasetti, United States Marine Corps test pilot for the Joint Strike Fighter program.
In 2001, Lieutenant Colonel Tomasetti achieved a real milestone in aviation history. Flying the prototype JSF, he was the first man to do a short takeoff, followed by a supersonic flight, finishing with a vertical landing all in one mission.
It showed the versatility of the airplane to be able to have a supersonic capability, but still have the capability to land anywhere and take off from just about anywhere it provides you.
The JSF achieved this extraordinary feat due to its unique engine system, which is based on the same principles as the Harrier. The engine has a large rear nozzle that can be directed both backwards and downwards. But it also incorporates a new piece of technology that the Harrier doesn't have, a massive fan just behind the pilot, powered by the engine.
The lit fan allows a tremendous amount of thrust to be harnessed out of the propulsion system and give the airplane a capability to do its vertical part of its work with a lot more payload than we've ever experienced in airplanes before.
The fan is activated when vents open up just behind the pilot. Air is sucked down and pushed out the bottom of the plane. So, together with the rear nozzle, the aircraft is balanced on two pillars of thrust.
The rear nozzle, in addition to pointing straight down, can twist in yaw, which allows the airplane to pivot in the sky and perform 360-degree turns. The airplane can fly sideways, the airplane can fly backwards just by vectoring the rear nozzle.
And while in hover, the plane is controlled by onboard computers.
Unlike previous airplanes, for example in the Harrier, where the pilot has been responsible for controlling the thrust vector and making the inputs required to have the airplane do all those maneuvers, in the JSF airplane, the pilot's just going to ask for go forward, go backwards, turn left, turn right, and the computers now are responsible for wiggling all the parts in the airplane necessary to achieve that maneuver.
The use of onboard computers to help fly a plane is now essential in all strike planes and has totally revolutionised the face of air combat. Computers are now used to fly planes that humans couldn't keep in the sky. The first plane to pioneer this use of onboard flight computers was the F-16 Fighting Falcon. In fact, it can't fly without them. The F-16s of 4th Fighter Squadron at Hill Air Force Base near Salt Lake City, Utah, are on standby, ready to deploy to a war zone at a moment's notice.
I'm Major Tom Hagen, F-16 pilot with the 4th Fighter Squadron.
Major Hagen has been an F-16 pilot for 10 years.
Well, the F-16 was originally designed as a low-cost, lightweight fighter, and now it has evolved through many years to a very high-tech weapon system. We drop many different types of air-to-ground ordnance, so it's a very, very dynamic jet.
Major Tom Hagen and 3 other F-16 pilots are going on a bombing training mission. To maintain their state of readiness, they fly at least 3 times a week. Every mission, even for training, has the potential for accidents or even death.
Major danger is the ground. Our #1 concern when we're flying low altitude is to not hit the ground, so maintaining our altitude awareness and our situational awareness with respect to terrain and each other is a major issue.
The F-16s of 4th Squadron are strike bombers designed to take out targets on the ground.
Our primary job is dropping bombs, primarily laser-guided bombs. We carry just about all different types of bombs that you might imagine. 2 different types of air-to-air missiles, rockets for marking targets and whatnot. So just about every piece of ordnance that you can think about we carry on the jet.
The F-16 is an extremely agile plane, something it achieves with a revolutionary design concept. It has an airframe that is designed not to stay in the air. Traditional planes like the F-15 or civilian airliners have stable aerodynamic airframes that will naturally return to level, safe flight if left to their own devices. The F-16 uses an entirely different concept built into its design and manufacture. It has an aerodynamically unstable airframe that constantly wants to bank and spin, and that willingness to turn helps the plane to perform complex maneuvers. But of course, the more unstable the design, the less the plane wants to right itself and stay in the air. The only solution is to have a powerful onboard computer constantly correcting the inherent instability by moving the flaps, rudder and ailerons thousands of times a second in addition to the pilot's inputs. Without the computer, the F-16 would literally fall out of the sky.
From the pilot's perspective, it's very stable. From a aeronautics perspective, it's an unstable aircraft.
With a single powerful engine, the F-16 is much smaller and lighter than the F-15.
Well, it's a big acceleration, roller coaster rides, whatnot. It's very difficult to imagine that, but it's a big kick when we start running down the runway. The engine has an afterburner on it, so we can select AB thrust, which gives us about 28,000 pounds of thrust. It goes up to speeds of 800 knots and 2.0 Mach. So it's a very fast jet as well.
Unlike the F-15, which isn't designed for low maneuvers, the F-16 can operate at any altitude.
We work in all altitude regimes from way down at 100 feet all the way up to the high 30s. We can bomb from very, very low to very, very high. From the various campaigns that we've seen in the past 20 years, it's an extremely lethal weapon system.
Like the F-15 and the Harrier jump jet, the F-16 has been a very successful frontline strike plane, but it too has one great weakness. It can be detected by radar and could be vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire or surface-to-air missiles. The only way to avoid being spotted on radar is to become invisible, to become stealthy. The only foolproof way to avoid being shot down while attacking deep behind enemy lines is to make sure no one can see you, to make yourself invisible. On the edge of the White Sands Desert in New Mexico is Holloman Air Force Base, the home of the most radical strike plane ever created, the stealth bomber, the F-117 Nighthawk. A plane so strange that when pilots saw the first one, they thought it was a joke. It's made look like an alien spaceship, but the F-117 is the logical step forward from the F-16, a strike bomber that is invisible to radar.
I'm Major Trey Urso, and I fly the F-117 stealth fighter.
Major Urso's job is to constantly evaluate the F-117.
The F-117 was designed and built to enable it to fly into the most heavily defended areas on Earth. Its design optimizes its ability to get into those areas without being detected, tracked, and shot by the enemy.
The key to its success is its shape, angles and surfaces that do not reflect radar beams.
It was designed so that it could penetrate heavily defended airspace, and any enemy radar systems that might be looking for that aircraft will either be deflected away or will be absorbed by low observable RAM cover. Anytime you've got an edge, you have the potential for a radar to see that edge. So there's some really smart engineering that went into to make sure that those edges are all optimized and as flush as possible to ensure there's no radar cross-section bloom to the enemy radar systems.
Any irregular shapes, such as fuel tanks or weapons, are hidden inside the plane. And because the engines are baffled, the plane is almost silent to anyone on the ground.
Well, hopefully by the time the enemy would hear an F-117, the bombs have already gone off and we're well on our way home.
To further minimize detection, the F-117 only attacks at night and alone.
It's a completely different mindset when you're flying this aircraft. Unlike other frontline fighters, we typically employ by ourselves. We will fly into and out of combat zones on an optimized route that will give us the best chance to get into and out of that area without being detected and or engaged by the enemy.
Because they attack under the cover of darkness, they use night vision to identify targets.
The F-117 utilizes infrared target and tracking systems that basically gives us a TV picture of what's out in front of us. Once we see the general area that we're flying towards, we can then move the aircraft and funnel ourselves towards the target that we're trying to go after. We'll essentially see a black and white picture of the target that we're going after and be able to employ ordnance onto that target by visually identifying it.
When the F-117 was originally conceived, the first priority was to make it stealthy. The result was a design that was incredibly unstable. But using the lessons learned from the F-16, the designers were able to get the strange angular airframe to fly using a sophisticated computerized flight control system.
The F-117 cannot fly without its computers to help it. It's a fly-by-wire aircraft, and without those computers, the aircraft basically doesn't know which way is up and which way is down. When we're in a combat zone and we're focused on getting our weapons onto a target, we're basically on full autopilot, and we let the aircraft fly itself into and out of those heavily defended areas.
Without computers to keep the plane flying, the lone pilot could easily become overloaded with information and miss the target, or even hit the wrong one.
There's no other country in the world that has anything like it. There's no other aircraft flying today that has the capabilities of this aircraft.
The F-117 revolutionized the evolution of strike planes. Its successful combat record has demonstrated the effectiveness of stealth in warfare. But even this amazing plane can't do it all. Like the Harrier, it can't go supersonic, and if seen by the naked eye, it is vulnerable to other fighters as it doesn't carry a gun. What was needed was a fast, stealthy strike plane, the FA-22 Raptor. In creating the FA-22, its US designers have gone for broke, building the first ever air-to-air fighter with a stealth capability. And it's the first stealthy plane to go supersonic.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Dave Rose, and I fly the FA-22 Raptor.
Lieutenant Colonel Rose is part of a team carrying out flight testing on the FA-22.
The FA-22 Raptor will be the aircraft that goes in there first and not only clears the skies of air threats, but also with the air-to-ground munitions can go in there and basically take out emerging threats.
This plane is the culmination of over 2 decades of design and testing and has incorporated the best features from all the strike planes currently in service.
The special thing about the Raptor is we've taken lessons learned from the ages of air combat, and we've taken the attributes of what would you like to basically do your job as a fighter pilot, and we put them into one aircraft. Stealth has been around a long time. With the FA-22, we call it 4th generation. We've taken all that lessons learned to not only be able to, from a shape or applications, to not be seen or to be seen very late by threat radars, but also be able to maintain that. So it's not just go for one mission. I need to be able to maintain that on the ramp for a persistent capability.
The F-117 had to be angular to be stealthy, but advances in stealth technology means the FA-22 Raptor can have familiar curved aerodynamic surfaces and still remain invisible to radar. The Raptor carries powerful electrical detection systems that can scan the airspace up to 1,200 kilometers around it. This ability to spot the enemy from such a large distance, combined with its invisibility, gives the FA-22 pilots an unbeatable advantage in combat.
First thing with the Raptor is they don't see you. I see them, but they don't see me. So now if I need to, I can go ahead and engage them and make them go away. Now I can get into within visual range, and with, again, my stealth and capability to maneuver, very quickly I can attrit that threat and leave the area. So I lose a lot less heartbeats.
Unlike its predecessor, the F-117, the Raptor is very fast. It has 2 staggeringly powerful engines that produce 70,000 pounds of thrust. It also has a secret engine advance called Super Cruise that maintains supersonic speeds without using an afterburner.
The Raptor was built to actually maneuver at high altitude, above 50,000 feet, and to be able to go up there in what we call Super Cruise, essentially go supersonic, faster than the speed of sound, without using the afterburner, so I don't use a lot of fuel.
Super Cruise has another advantage in combat.
The main thing at night, if I go to afterburner in my F-15 that I've flown for 18 years, I've got this big flame coming out the back, so everybody sees me, anywhere from the guy with a gun on the ground to all the surface-to-air missiles. With the capability to go fast, basically without using this big flame out the back, Super Cruise, then I have a lot less susceptibility to the said threats.
Like the F-16 and the F-117, the basic design of the FA-22 is highly unstable and totally dependent on computers to fly.
You basically put the stick where you need it and the throttles where you need it, and it'll do the rest. It allows you to maneuver the airplane to the extremes and able to ultimately get the job done and still be able to maintain control.
The Raptor has one last trick up its sleeve, thrust vectoring. Inspired by the Harrier jump jet, it can direct the thrust from its engines up and down. It can't take off vertically or hover, but it radically improves its air maneuverability.
The thrust vector capability of the Raptor gives it an opportunity to make it turn a lot quicker and continue to be able to basically point your nose. In a regular type of basic fighter maneuver, he who gets his nose in a weapons envelope first wins the fight. So with this actual thrust vectoring capability, we can really turn the airplane and essentially maneuver it twice as better as other airplanes.
At an estimated cost of over $120 million each, the FA-22 is one of the most technologically advanced military planes ever built. It's much more sophisticated and deadly than any enemy plane it is ever likely to come up against. Just knowing you might be up against a Raptor is enough to keep your aircraft on the ground.
With the FA-22 Raptor, we can go down there and kick down the door and make sure as threats emerge, I can take them out. It's a lethal weapon, it's a lethal deterrent.
While the US has gone down the route of stealth with the FA-22, Britain and its European partners have gone for super manoeuvrability, creating their own advanced strike plane, the Eurofighter Typhoon. It can cruise at supersonic speeds, carry out complex manoeuvres at high G-forces, and has the most sophisticated pilot interface ever created.
My name is Craig Penrice. I'm the Eurofighter Typhoon project pilot.
Craig Penrice is stationed at Preston Air Base, where he has been flight testing the Eurofighter.
It's every fighter pilot's dream. I know that sounds very corny, but it's true. Cockpit that shows you, tells you everything that's happening in the world around you to allow you to be tactical. Thrust and manoeuvrability, carefree handling, all put together make it, a wondrous joy, fantastic airplane to fly.
Many fighters like the F-15 and F-16 have been highly manoeuvrable, but only at subsonic speeds. What sets the Eurofighter apart is that it can pull off these kinds of moves while flying supersonic.
When you aggressively manoeuvre this airplane, the roll rates that you generate are quite frankly startling. It really feels like you're on the outside of a washing machine being spun around. The roll rates will leave your head pinned to one side of the canopy if you're not careful. The airplane's capable of 9G, 9 times the force of gravity. This is a fairly tight turn in anybody's language. 9G is sort of currently recognised to be sort of physiologically a limiting factor.
The F-15 and F-16 were also capable of pulling 9 Gs, but only for short bursts. The Eurofighter is different. It can fly at 9 Gs for extended periods. But in order to keep its pilots conscious, they must wear a specially designed Typhoon G-suit.
One of the drawbacks of all this agility and all this G is that it does weird things to your body. So through the years we've developed various G protection systems. But with Eurofighter being that much more of a high G airplane, we obviously have to give the pilot the best chance of not losing consciousness. So in addition to G trousers, we have inflatable boots in here. We connect the G-suit trouser connection here into the boot. That allows the air to be forced down into bladders that are in the boot. They inflate, squeeze my foot, and just further increase the coverage of this G protection device. A matching pair. Zipping up, slightly unique, going from top to bottom, so that the zip doesn't slip down under the forces of gravity. It's already down there, keeping me in there. Flying helmet, providing impact protection, crash helmet, providing communications. We take this airplane to places that without this equipment you just simply wouldn't survive.
This suit can keep the pilot alert and conscious while pulling 9 Gs almost indefinitely. Crucial when going on a mission at 12,000 metres. The Eurofighter is a lethal killing machine and can carry air-to-air missiles, air-to-surface missiles and anti-tank bombs. The targeting systems for these weapons appear on a head-up display or inside the pilot's visor, so they can aim and fire them without ever having to look down.
When you're in a dogfight with somebody, you really don't want to take your eyes off the guy you're fighting, because he can do something while you're not looking. So many fights have been lost in the past where somebody's looked inside the cockpit to check his height or his speed or his fuel and looked back outside and lo and behold the bad guy's disappeared. We don't need to do that with our helmet. We can keep our eyes locked onto the bad guy and have in our immediate field of view all the information we need. Yeah, it's a huge, huge tactical advantage.
The Eurofighter's 2 engines generate a combined thrust of about 40,000 pounds, pushing it to a top speed of 2,125 kilometres an hour, almost twice the speed of sound.
When you let the brakes off on the runway with full power, you're accelerating at 30 knots per second. That's about 35, 36 miles per hour every second. So that's 0 to 100 in car speak in 3 seconds. That's quite frankly stunning. You're pinned to the seat when you're going off. And it also means that you can be at 40,000 feet within a minute of takeoff and only 5 miles down the road from the runway that you took off from. It's rocket ship territory there, really.
This staggering acceleration gets the pilot to the fight fast.
Translated into a fighting situation, basically for air-to-air, the plane that gets the highest, the quickest and fastest is going to have the best first shoot opportunity. So the higher I am and the faster I am, the greater range any given missile will have when it leaves my airplane. So I want to get as high and as fast as I can, as quickly as I can. That's where excess thrust is always a bonus. Sight is life and speed is groovy. You can't fight what you can't see, and you haven't got speed, you aren't going to defeat him either.
The Typhoon's afterburners can effortlessly push the plane through the sound barrier.
Supersonic's just a number. Nothing happens, the controls don't reverse, it doesn't go all blurred, it doesn't shake, it just very smoothly slips through the speed of sound. No change in sound, no change in feel of the airplane, but you get there very, very quickly. We can accelerate from subsonic to supersonic in a heartbeat.
Like the FA-22, the Eurofighter can maintain supersonic flight without its afterburners on, using supercruise. It not only saves fuel, it also reduces the infrared signature of the plane, making it less susceptible to anti-aircraft fire. The Eurofighter is not stealthy. It has no need to be. It can fly its entire mission supersonically, and it's designed to fight its battles from a distance.
No self-respecting fighter pilot in a real engagement wants to get into a dogfight, but it's an area that you must be prepared to go into if needs must. A real fighter pilot wants to be up there, get as high and as fast as he can, shoot first and run away bravely and home for tea and medals. But there will be situations where a close identity or getting into a dogfight is required. So as well as the performance to get high and fast, you also have to have the ability to manoeuvre in a close-in dogfight.
Like other modern strike planes, the Eurofighter has an inherently unstable design. It's built with a delta-shaped wing and 2 small canards on the front, the secret of its incredible manoeuvrability. To turn 20 tons of unstable metal into an agile fighter requires 3 computers which control the plane using a revolutionary software system called carefree handling.
Carefree handling in the airplane simply means that I don't have a care in the world when it comes to manoeuvring my airplane. The flight control computers are constantly looking at what speed height I've got and will limit their response appropriate to the state the airplane's in. So I don't have to worry about exceeding any limit. The airplane will look after me. You simply point the airplane where you want it to go and let go of the stick and it will continue to going there forever and a day. If you put all the things together, such as carefree handling, the thrust from the engines and the performance of the airplane, you take so much of the workload away from the pilot and he simply just has to manoeuvre in relation to the other airplane. You don't have to worry about the limits, you don't have to worry about anything else, just get on and fight the fight.
The Eurofighter is the ultimate strike plane, fast, manoeuvrable and deadly. It is the pinnacle of a development process that started with the F-15 some 30 years ago.
The F-15 and other contemporary fighters that I've been lucky enough to fly are all very, very good airplanes. But anybody climbing into this airplane will be able to feel and experience a distinct advantage over any of these contemporary airplanes.
The latest strike planes are the most advanced piloted military aeroplanes ever produced, but they may also be the last. As technology continues to develop with more aerodynamically unstable machines capable of ever greater speeds and manoeuvrability, there is a problem. It's not computing, airframe design or materials, it's human physiology. The human body simply cannot survive the astonishing G-forces the planes will be able to achieve. It could be that the F-35, Raptor and Eurofighter are the last strike planes ever to be flown by humans. The strike planes of the future may well be pilotless.